About 20 years ago, I used to work for a company in Glasgow that made furniture in an old rundown warehouse by the River Clyde. While I was there, I saw something that has haunted me ever since. I'm still not sure what it was. Maybe you can help me out with that. The workshop was owned by a man named Bill Miller. I was 17 at the time and hadn't gotten on well at school. I had almost no qualifications, but Bill gave me a shot at learning how to craft and build wooden furniture. Initially, I hated the idea. It sounded like something an old man should have been doing, not a 17-year-old. Though my parents were over the moon that I had at least found work, and even a possible trade. The workshop was filled with old machinery way past its prime, and the warehouse was far larger than it needed to be. I think at one time Bill's business had prospered when he had employed a large team for decades, but it looked to me like those days were numbered. He now worked on his own. Still, he took me in. I think more than anything he wanted to pass on skills that were soon going to be lost forever as everything modernized. Bill must have been in his 60s at the time. He was eccentric and used to wear brightly colored clothes in his workshop like he thought he was an art teacher. From my first day, I was put off by how happy he always was. I guess I was a bit of an edgelord back then and thought he was past it. I'm ashamed to say that it took me a while to come around to him and see him for what he was, a sweet guy who just wanted to help a kid who had no prospects. For the first few weeks, he shadowed me closely and showed me the ropes, teaching me the names of all the tools and what they did. Then he moved me onto some basic tasks I was to repeat over and over. He was always saying, "This is how I got my start, or in 3 years you won't believe what you'll be able to make." He had a strange view of the world. The way he taught carpentry and other skills, he talked about it like it was secretly so important, and that we as furniture makers were sharing in that secret, that we were creating something new in the world, and were making furniture that would last 100 years and bring joy and comfort to people. Who knows who will own some of these pieces in the generations to come, he'd say, a twinkle in his eye and a kind grin behind a bushy graying beard. He was so enthusiastic about it all. The first time I saw that smile melt away was one day when I headed to the rear of the warehouse. During my lunch break, Bill was up front working on a set of dining chairs. When he was focusing like that, he rarely looked up to see what I was doing. I guess I was bored having no one else to talk to, so I decided to explore the building a little. At the rear of the main workshop room, there was a faded, brown wooden door. I had noticed it a few times, though never thought much of it. As I wandered to the back of the large main room, I found myself turning the door handle and going inside. There was a windowless corridor made of red brick that moved off to the left. It was lit by some dull yellow incandescent bulbs overhead. As I stood there, I thought I heard a noise, though I couldn't quite make it out. I started walking towards the end of the corridor, where it turned to the right at a sharp angle. As I did, the noise got a little louder, but I still couldn't put together what it was in my mind. I remember that when I reached the sharp turn, I suddenly realized that Bill was behind me. He nearly made me jump out of my skin. "What are you doing?" he asked. I'd never known his voice to be so blank, so lacking in emotion. I turned and saw that all the happiness that so easily flowed from the man had gone. He had a stern expression like one of my old teachers about to chastise me. "I was just looking around, I think," I said. Then he told me, "You don't need to be in here. I've got a problem with a leak and some mold in those back rooms. It's not good to breathe that stuff in." I shrugged my shoulders and walked back into the workshop. Even though Bill seemed tense in a way I wasn't used to, I didn't ask about it, and I spent the rest of the afternoon sweeping up the main area in the warehouse. I didn't think much more of it until the following day. I came into work, and Bill was already there. He was whistling away as usual, finishing up on the dining chair set. The air was filled with the strong smell of the varnish he was using. "Morning," I said. He looked up from his work and smiled, but when I walked past him to go and put my bag and coat on its peg on the wall, he cleared his throat like he had something on his mind. "I meant to say, I had a good look at those rooms back there after yesterday," he said, pointing to the wooden door at the rear of the room. "It had been a while since I last checked. It's worse than I thought. The mold, I mean, spores in the air, I'm sure of it. So, you don't be going in there, okay? I want you to promise me that." "Sure," I said. He stared at me, Promise. I nodded. Okay, I promise. I was a little surprised, annoyed even, by his tone, but it was more than that. The door to the back corridors was now no longer accessible. Bill wasn't just telling me to not go in there, he had moved an old metal workbench in front of it, and then stacked boxes on top of that. I felt like a child being told not to play with matches. It's not like I couldn't have moved those things if I'd had a few minutes. That wasn't what bothered me. What got under my skin was that Bill clearly didn't trust me. He told me not to go back there already, and that should have been enough. But he had taken the time to stack up things in front of the door like I was going to go down there no matter what he said. I didn't express this though. I got on with the rest of my work, but throughout the day, I kept looking back at the door with the bench in front of it. It reminded me of worse times. 2 years before, when I was still at school, I had been suspended because a teacher did not believe my side of a story after a fight with another kid, and that sort of thing always stuck in my throat ever since. Not being believed or trusted, well, I took that as a personal insult. I know it sounds ridiculous now, but I kept thinking that day that Bill was just like the rest. He seemed to notice me looking back over my shoulder a couple of times throughout the day, and he grumbled to himself about not being able to put a lock on the door, which I didn't really understand. Despite feeling like I should go back there just to show him, I wasn't going to do that. My parents would have made my life hell if I had lost my apprenticeship. And besides, now a few weeks into the job, I was enjoying some of it. There was no hassle. I got a little money out of it, and I even started to think about what it would be like to open my own place like Bill one day. I let the whole thing go, but Bill didn't. Later that afternoon, I was sweeping up again when I heard a loud bang. There was no doubt about where it had come from. I watched as Bill turned and looked at the door. He stared at it for longer than necessary. All the blood had drained from his face, and he looked ill, much older than he usually did. He didn't say anything. He simply walked up to the door and put his hands on the metal bench and boxes, almost as if to see if it was sturdy enough. "You can go home early," he said without looking at me. I was okay with that. Who doesn't like to clock off early? But when I grabbed my things and said goodbye to Bill, he seemed completely preoccupied, like he was mulling something gravely serious over and over in his mind. The next morning, I was getting ready to go to work when my mom got a phone call from Bill. He said that I wasn't to go in, some problem with the building that he had to sort. So I took the day off and enjoyed having a bit of spare time to myself. But the next day, I was getting ready again, and we got another call from Bill. He told my mom that everything was fine, but that I should take the day off again while he fixed whatever was going on. He kept saying something about the air being bad. This went on for 2 weeks, and eventually my dad grew frustrated. He thought Bill wanted to get rid of me for some reason, but didn't have the heart to come out and say it. My dad had been in the army when he was younger, and he always had that same hardened air about him that you sometimes see in veterans, but he also had anger issues boiling away underneath. We rarely got on. I could always tell when he was going to intervene in something because he would get out the black suit that he almost never wore and would spend the evening pressing it and shining his shoes like he was going on a military drill the next day. As sure as clockwork, I woke up in the morning and Bill phoned again to say that I still couldn't come in. My dad got dressed in his suit, told me to put my work clothes on, and then we drove down to Bill's warehouse. During the drive, my dad was gritting his teeth, his jaw clenched, and talking bad about Bill. He hated when people weren't forthright, and he felt I was getting the runaround. One thing my dad had was a temper, and it could come at any time. I had gotten used to seeing when it was winding up, ready to explode. I was genuinely worried about what he was going to say to Bill. Sometimes I wished my dad would stay out of things, but I knew when it was pointless to argue. He was going to let out whatever stress was burning a hole in his stomach no matter what. When we turned up at the warehouse, I could hear one of the circular saws running inside. That meant Bill was working. Dad opened the door to the warehouse, and we stepped inside. Bill didn't notice us at first. He was cutting large sections of timber on the circular saw. My eyes were drawn immediately to the rear of the room. I couldn't believe it. There, in front of the door that led to the back rooms, was now a huge wooden frame. I knew what it was immediately. Bill was constructing some sort of wall. He was literally blocking off the door and the corridors and rooms beyond it, though he hadn't gotten much further than the large frame. Bill, I remember my dad shouting over the noise. Well, it all went to pot then. For the first time that I had seen, Bill grew angry. He questioned why we were there and was short with my dad. "You need to go," he said, walking over to us, waving his hands about trying to usher us out of the door. This was like a red rag to a bull for my dad. He hated anyone trying to tell him what to do, even more so than me. He started shouting over Bill, and I was kind of ashamed of my dad then. He puffed his chest out and towered over him, and I could see that Dad was basically trying to physically intimidate the old guy into backing down. "Dad, let's just go," I remember saying, but he wasn't having any of it. "You agreed to train my son," he said in a booming voice. "It's been 2 weeks without work or pay. 2 weeks he could have been out there looking for another job. Now you disrespect him, and me by cutting him off without even telling us." "Why?" Bill hesitated then. "I'm not cutting him off. I never said that. There's bad air in the building. It isn't safe. I can't have him working here until it is." My dad looked around. "I don't see you wearing a mask to protect you from this so-called bad air. There's no smell of any mold or anything. What are you doing here?" Dad marched past Bill. He always had a way of going overboard and sticking his nose into other people's business. I guess it's where I get my fiery side. I remember Dad walking up to the wooden frame at the back of the room, and Bill jumped in front of him like he was trying to stop something terrible from happening. I won't give you a blow-by-blow account, but things escalated. Bill pushed my dad in the chest, and then Dad started to yell, saying that he was sure Bill was up to something bad. Dad yelled that he was going to look in the back and find out just what the old man was hiding. I know exactly why he did that. Whenever my dad would get into a confrontation like that, he'd always try to find something to get under the other person's skin. It was like whatever the argument was about no longer mattered. Now, it was only about getting the other person more and more upset. Dad pushed Bill aside and walked up to the wooden frame and climbed through it. Then, he put his shoulder into the door, and it opened. "There's no bad air in here," he said, looking into the red brick corridor before turning back to Bill. "You're hiding something, aren't you? What is it? Please don't go in there," Bill said, his voice wavering. I'll never forget the fear in his eyes, but Dad went inside anyway. Bill tried to stop me, but I felt I had to follow my dad. He'd have accused me of being a turncoat otherwise, so I went in too. Dad marched along the hallway and turned at the corner. I was close behind him and noticed that a couple of the light bulbs on the ceiling seemed to flicker as we passed. There must have been 4 or 5 doors to various storage rooms around the corner, in what was probably an old office, going by the faded sign on one of the doors. But there was only one door that we headed for, and it was because there was a sound coming from beyond it. The same sound I had heard, but now, closer to it, I could tell what it was. We could hear a sort of muffled voice, like a woman's. "He's got someone locked up in there," my dad said loudly. "The old pervert." I didn't know what to say. He was right. There was definitely someone in that room, talking like they were gagged or something. It was like the woman couldn't quite get out her words. Dad wasn't going to hang around. He went to the door and opened it. I was behind and looking over his shoulder. My dad was taller than me, so I stretched up to see inside. It was a dusty storeroom made from the same red brick as the corridor, but with shelves and cardboard boxes strewn around. A single yellow light bulb glistened above it, casting shadows all around. In the middle of the floor was a space, and occupying part of it was a large old wooden chest with what looked like a closed, hinged top. I was taken aback by how tall and wide it was, the top of it almost as high as my chest. "Please leave me alone." I remember Bill shouting from back at the workshop. I guess he was too frightened to go all the way into where we were. Dad stepped into the room, and I quickly followed. The woman's voice was coming from inside the chest. It was muffled, and it sounded almost like she was choking on water as she tried to speak. There was something about the chest that added to the apprehension building inside of me. I had seen enough of Bill's workmanship to know that he was the one who had made the chest, though it looked to be decades old. Have you ever had a fear that stopped you from doing something? I have, and it was at that moment I wanted to open the lid, but somehow I knew I shouldn't. My dad had no such hesitation. He reached forward to the chest. I shouted no, but it was too late. He pulled up on the lid and it creaked open. There was a horrible stench like sewage, and I could see that the chest was filled to the brim with a viscous, black liquid. On the surface was a thick film which looked like congealed wax or fat. This bobbed around on the top as the liquid quivered. My dad stopped and stared at the water as if he couldn't quite comprehend what he was looking at. Something then sprung out of the chest, almost like a jack-in-a-box. It was covered in white cloth, and I remember the arms reaching out and grabbing my dad by the throat and hair. It yanked him forward into the chest so that his head and shoulders disappeared into the black liquid contained within. I could hear my dad drowning and screaming under the liquid, his legs and body still dangling out of the chest. I leapt forward and grabbed hold of him, but whatever was in the chest had him in a vice-like grip. It wasn't going to let go anytime soon. I realized in that moment that my dad was going to die if I didn't do something about it. Panicked and feeling helpless, I looked around the room for anything that could save him, but nothing jumped out at me. Then I finally thought of something. I rushed out of the room and along the red brick corridor, turned left, and then I was through the door back into the dusty workshop. Bill was standing there, white as a sheet. "It's got him," I said. "It's got my dad." He didn't say anything. He just stood there like a rabbit caught in headlights. I ran and grabbed a heavy rubber mallet we used for knocking large dowels into wood, and then I was off again, down the corridor, and back into that room. Dad had stopped moving. His body was limp. All that I could hear now was the sound of the black liquid lapping up against him as cloth-covered hands started to pull the rest of his body inside the chest. I rushed forward and lifted the mallet as high as I could and brought it smashing into the side of the chest. The wood was too thick. I smacked it again and again, hoping I could crack the damn thing open, but it was no use. It was only then that someone rushed past me. "That won't do it, son," Bill said, holding a large wood axe in his hands. He stepped up and hit the chest on the right side again and again. Each time it splintered and cracked. Black, festering liquid poured out through those cracks onto the floor, and I watched as Bill carefully made sure none of it touched him. There was a garbled scream from the black water as the surface level now dipped suddenly. I pulled at my dad's lifeless body. In that moment, as Bill cracked the entire chest in two, I lurched back and I fell to the floor, Dad falling on top of me. Looking up, I saw nothing but black liquid draining away on the floor, moving under the doorway. And then, it was as if none of it had happened. The floor was bone dry. "He's drowned," I said, tears in my eyes. "No, he hasn't," the old man replied. "The water is gone from him too." Bill came over to my dad, turned him on his side, and smacked him on the back. Some black fluid spewed from his mouth, and that too seemed to unnaturally run out under the door and into the corridor. Then, Bill rolled my dad back over on the ground and carried out CPR. Thankfully, Dad coughed a few times and suddenly opened his eyes. Within a few minutes, we were able to get him onto his feet and bring him back into the workshop without saying a word. Bill made us some coffee and got an old stove going in the corner of the warehouse to keep my old man warm. As I draped a blanket around Dad's shoulders, who now seemed older somehow than he ever had before, Bill told us only enough to make sure we didn't call the police. As far as I remember, he said something along the lines of, "I don't know what that thing is. I found it here when I moved into the warehouse. It was kept in an old oil barrel under the floorboards. How did it end up in the chest?" I asked, still in shock. "I made it for the thing," he replied. "One of my apprentices, a few years back, opened the oil drum by accident, and I had a hell of a time getting him out of it when the thing inside grabbed him. The boy ran out of here immediately. He was never the same. He had a streak of white through his hair after that." My dad said nothing. He just stared at the floor as if looking into a pit that could swallow him up at any time. I realized the oil drum was corroded and could leak at any moment. Bill continued, "I was scared the thing would get out and hurt someone else, so I got the barrel up with a winch and then drained every last drop into that chest I made." "Why?" my dad started. Finally, "Why didn't you secure it?" "I tried," Bill said. "You see, the thing, it seems to know when it's locked up. I put a lock on that chest years ago. I even had a lock on the door. But whenever there was a lock, something terrible always followed." "Like what?" I asked. Bill looked profoundly sad, as if thinking about something he wished he could forget. "Just trust me when I say, bad things happened. I took the locks off after that. I won't go over it anymore. It's gone now though, right?" Dad asked. Bill shook his head. "Whoever put it in that barrel and under the floor meant it to be kept away. Now it's drained into the building, into the ground. It'll be here somewhere. I'll need to shut the whole place up now. I suppose it's been coming for a long time. Serves me right for wanting some company around here." He smiled at me. I felt sorry for him. After that, my dad started to get angry. He chewed Bill out for putting me in danger by having me work there. I think that's something I've never really understood. Maybe he wanted the company, as he said, or maybe he was frightened to be alone in that building, but couldn't bring himself to move on and close down a lifetime of work. There's not much more I can say about it. I never went back to the warehouse. After floating around for a while, I got a job working and training in the Merchant Navy as an engineer. Life's been good for the most part, but I do think about what happened in Bill's old workshop quite often. In fact, I'm not sure that I can give you an exact explanation, but I can tell you some things that followed. A few years ago, I started to research the history of the warehouse. I discovered that long before Bill owned it, the building was used as a temporary mortuary during the Spanish flu outbreak, when so many died in the city that they had problems storing people's remains. The backlog for cremations and burials was so great that bodies were decomposing long before they could be embalmed for later funerals. One comment I found in an old newspaper cutting reported about a public outcry when there were rumors that a shortage of the usual chemicals used for preservation resulted in improvised techniques for preserving the dead. One such rumor was that the bodies were being kept in barrels of machine oil. The last thing I'll say is this: Bill shut his workshop down after the chest was broken open and the liquid poured out. I'll never forget what he said about that. Now it's drained into the building, into the ground. It'll be around here somewhere. Bill's body was found at the workshop 2 years after that. He had apparently been checking on the building after it had been damaged slightly during a storm. Though the cause of death was recorded as unknown, the pathologist left a note that, while Bill Miller's body presented all the signs of death by drowning, no water was ever found in his lungs. "10 years ago, I pulled my wife's scorched, lifeless body out of a Florida swimming pool. We had only been married for 3 days. You read that right? 3 days. I wish the story didn't start there, but it does. Avery Jones was my soulmate. She was funny, spunky, and cute as hell. I was so deeply, ridiculously in love with her. And for good reason. She was way out of my league, but somehow, she liked me enough to marry me. After 6 months of dating, and another 6 months of engagement, we got married in a humble chapel in the Wasatch Mountains, just outside of Salt Lake City. The next day, we flew out for a 10-day honeymoon at a beachfront resort in Fort Lauderdale, a wedding gift from my parents. On our second day there, while laying out on the beach, gnarly clouds blew in, accompanied by the heaviest rain I had ever seen. We laughed at our luck, packed up quickly, and ran with the rest of the beach and pool goers towards the hotel. "Come this way," Avery said, pulling me down a narrow stone path through the landscape to a secluded cave installation under a bridge. Laughing hysterically with the help of our rain-diluted Mai Tais, we shed our dripping wet clothes and towels and sat down on the pool chairs in the cave. "You know we could swim right here," Avery said, pointing to the portion of the pool covered by the faux rock. I pretended to think it was a bad idea, then tackled her into the water. We splashed and wrestled around for a few minutes by ourselves, the heavy rain clapping outside the cave. After a few minutes, I hopped out and grabbed a couple dry towels from a nearby chair. I kicked my feet up and sat back, sipping my drink. Avery began an interpretive, synchronized swimming routine in her bright blue bikini. She whipped her auburn hair back and forth and swung her hands above her head with effortless grace. Even though she was joking, I was mesmerized. She was mine. I was hers. It was surreal. But then I got a feeling, a horrible feeling, one that said disaster was imminent. I didn't say anything to Avery though, since I prided myself on being rigidly pragmatic. Giving credence to feelings on only our 3rd day of marriage seemed like a bad idea. Whether it was a premonition or not, lightning struck the pool with a deafening crack. A deadly shockwave surged through the pool, killing Avery instantly and shooting me back against the rock wall. Once my hearing and sight returned, I saw Avery floating face down in the pool, 20 feet away from the cave. I yelled for help and jumped in. Hotel staff ran over, and together we got her out of the pool. Medical staff arrived shortly thereafter, and then an ambulance. She was pronounced dead on sight. The next day, we flew home, one of us seated in coach, the other in a body bag stashed below deck. I fell into a funk after the funeral, and never recovered. I was convinced Avery was my soulmate, so when she died, the world fell out of working order. Nothing made sense anymore. I never dated again nor had any interest in women, or people for that matter. I took a job in Texas, bought a townhome, and quickly got into a routine. I talked to my parents occasionally, but only returned home maybe 3 times over the last 10 years. Not a day goes by that I don't think about her. Hell, not even an hour. As our 10th anniversary approached, the data analytics firm I worked for was bought by another company, and I was let go. Though I was initially pissed, my tune shifted once the generous severance check came in the mail. The night the check came, I drank a lot and stumbled through Avery and my wedding album. Sometime around 1 in the morning, I made a decision. I decided that a decade of mourning was long enough. I decided that the next 10 years of my life weren't going to be steeped in self-pity. I would make something of myself. I'd enjoy books again. I'd make videos again. I'd make friends. I'd pick up the guitar. The next night, with a drink in hand and money in the bank, I sat down at my desk and developed a plan with a vague goal of getting out of the country for a little bit. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, I fell into the rabbit hole called the Flat Earth Theory. I spent the next 3 hours reading and watching YouTube videos. For some reason, it all got funnier and funnier as the night went on. I didn't accomplish much that night, but by the next night, I had a solid plan. Over the next couple months, I sold my townhome, bought a camera, and booked an around-the-world trip in 5 flights. My objective was to document my travels and prove, once and for all, that the world was round. For the 3 weeks before my trip began, I moved back to Salt Lake City with my parents, who were surprisingly supportive of the endeavor. In my first video, I explained the rules. I would travel east until I made it back home. I would have a compass on me at all times. I would be awake and alert at all times of travel. Anyone who was staunch in their belief that the world is flat would likely think I'm faking the whole thing. But that wasn't really the point of the trip. I was trying to become a new man. Remember, the day before I left, I was feeling nervous and oddly existential, more so than normal. This was big, traveling around the world by myself. I never dreamed I could have done something like this, especially since Avery died. Part of me was proud of myself. The other part of me was questioning what the hell I was doing. Whatever it was, I decided to leave something behind to commemorate my existence. I stayed up late scrolling through thousands of pictures and ultimately choosing 4 for print: Avery and me on our wedding day, my cousin and me on skateboards, my parents and me last Christmas, and a horribly awkward picture of me standing by myself outside my Texas townhome. I rolled the pictures up tight, stuffed them in a dry Guinness bottle, then took the bottle and a shovel up the mountain behind my parents' house. About a quarter mile up the hill, I found a nice clearing amongst the scrub oak and dug a hole 2 feet deep. With my headlamp, I could see Avery's eyes peering at me through the thick brown bottle. I cried for a good 5 minutes, then tossed it into the hole. I covered it the best I could and returned home to get a couple hours of shut-eye before flying out. My dad drove me to the airport the next morning. I flew from Salt Lake to New York, New York to Amsterdam, Amsterdam to Shanghai, Shanghai to Los Angeles, then Los Angeles to Salt Lake. I'm intentionally not getting into too much detail about the trip itself, because that's not really the point of me writing this. Okay, I'll indulge a little bit. How long did the trip take? A little over a month. I spent about a week in each place, and 3 days in Los Angeles. Did I have fun? Hell yes, I had the time of my life. I realized that being away from the drudgery of my routine allowed some of my old self to reemerge. My pre-lightning strike days. I made friends. I was funny. I was charming. It was a little weird, honestly. Was it good for me? Other than what I'm about to tell you, yes, it was fantastic. I truly feel like a changed man. Did I gain a following? I actually did. I mean, I didn't go viral or anything, but as of this writing, I have about 50,000 subscribers. Most think the flat earth theory has to be BS, but some are believers. I don't know if any of them will ever read this. How do you feel about that lame time capsule now? I know you probably didn't have this question specifically, but this is important to me. The longer the trip went on, the more embarrassed I felt about the time capsule I left in the ground behind my parents' house. The life I conveyed in that bottle was tinged with regret, loss, sorrow, particularly my apathetic face standing in front of my stupid townhome, or with my parents on Christmas. I decided, on my trip, that I wouldn't replace any of the pictures in the time capsule, but I would add some, change the ending of my story, if you will. Okay, enough of that. So, is the world round? That's where things get complicated. I successfully stayed awake during all hours of travel, which was very difficult, especially that Amsterdam to Shanghai leg. Good God, but I can confidently say that I traveled east the whole time, and successfully made it back to Salt Lake, which would rule out the whole flat earth thing. But I can't confidently say the earth is round either. Here's what happened. When I got home, both the front, back, and side doors were locked. I tried the garage keypad, but it didn't work. When I texted my mom, it failed to go through. Then I tried my dad. Same thing. I brushed it off, telling myself that a month is a long time. My parents could have switched cell carriers and could have changed the garage code. With no way into the house and nothing to do, I decided to make the planned modifications to my time capsule right then, even though it was dark out. I trekked up the mountain with a shovel from the back porch and found the spot 20 minutes later. I dug cautiously and successfully extracted the bottle. I saw Avery's eyes again peering at me through the brown bottle, this time a little foggy from sitting underground for a month. As I pulled the rolled up pictures out, I decided that merely adding new pictures wasn't going to solve my problems. I needed a ritual, a way to symbolize my rebirth. I thought about ripping up the old pictures or burning them. I thought about collecting everything I still owned of Avery's and throwing it into a bonfire. Perhaps I wouldn't be able to move on until I could erase Avery, the personification of my old, deceased self, from my life. Like I said before, I was a new man. Then I saw something at my feet. With the flashlight on my phone, I saw that I had dropped one of the old photos. It was the picture of me and my parents at dinner last Christmas at the Grand America Hotel. Only in this picture, there was a fourth person, a beautiful woman about my age with fair skin and long auburn hair. It was Avery. I was confused at first. Perhaps I had put a different picture in the bottle than I had thought. God knows Avery, and I had gone to plenty of dinners with my parents when she was alive, but I wouldn't have done that. I already had a picture of Avery and me on our wedding day. That was enough. I remember distinctly thinking one picture of Avery was enough. Then I looked closer at myself in that picture. It was definitely from last Christmas. It was 33-year-old me, not me at 23. I had a beard last Christmas, a feat I could not have managed when I was 23, since I printed the pictures only a month before. I pulled up the original on my phone with numb, shaky fingers and held them side by side. It was the same picture. I had before me two distinct realities, one in which Avery was alive and one in which Avery was dead. Everything else was the same. How the hell is this possible? I thought. The picture of our wedding day was the same. So was the picture of my cousin and me skateboarding. The picture of me standing in front of my Texas townhome was different though. Instead of a townhome, it was a small red house, apparently still in Texas. And, of course, Avery was standing next to me wearing a green plaid button-up shirt. Avery would have pursued her degree in nursing had she lived, I'm sure. The dual income would have allowed us to buy a house instead of a townhome, I figured. But still, what the hell is happening? My knees grew weak, and I sat down, looking back and forth between the two pictures with Avery now in them. She truly was stunning, more beautiful than I remembered. I stumbled into a new reality. I don't know how or when, but here I am, in a world where Avery lives. I'm sure that isn't the only difference, but it's the only one I'm aware of as of this writing. If I truly am in a new reality, what happened to the old one? Am I missing? Did I get duplicated? Did that old reality disappear? I laid on my back in the crunchy snow and closed my eyes. Where do I go from here? A pair of headlights flashed through the aspen trees, and I sat up abruptly. A car was pulling up the driveway. I shuffled my way down the snowy banks close to the house. I remained perched there for about 5 minutes before the kitchen lights clicked on and I saw 4 people emerge. two of them were my parents, looking the exact same as they did in the other reality. Then in walked Avery. Then, in a moment even more unsettling than seeing Avery alive, I saw myself enter the room. My heart was pounding. Other me was wearing the same outfit I'm wearing today, even sporting the same scruff. The only difference was the little bit of gray hair above his ears. I slid further down the hill to get a closer look. For a moment, a long moment, I forgot about my replica and watched Avery. She was gorgeous in person, more gorgeous than in pictures. She had always been that way. This is what my life would look like if I hadn't been such a coward, I thought, feeling a tear trickle down my cheek. The four of them talked and laughed excitedly, eventually shedding their coats and moving to the front living room. I climbed down the rock wall and ran around to the front of the house, hiding behind a group of pine trees near the front stairs. My dad left for a couple minutes and returned with a bottle of wine and 4 glasses. I fell deeper into a daze watching them, mostly Avery. They had a great time chatting for at least a couple hours, while I sat like a fool between the pines, my toes and hands freezing. She was so effortlessly charismatic, so charming. The way she talked with her eyes, the way her teeth flashed when she smiled, the way she leaned in when she was engaged. Everything about her was perfect. What I wouldn't do to steal this man's reality. I watched other me and Avery say their goodbyes and exit through the kitchen. Their car doors slammed shut, and I realized that I was going to lose them. In my reality, I was living at home while I did my around-the-world trip. Where would I have lived if I was still married to Avery? We had always talked about returning to the Salt Lake area eventually. Maybe they did it. As they rolled down the driveway in their 2019 Honda Accord, I ran to the side of the house and found an old bike from my childhood rusted against the wall. Both tires were flat and the front brakes didn't work, but since my parents lived way up in the mountains, wherever other me and Avery were going was downhill. Even though I went as fast as I could, they were long gone. Obviously, my 25-year-old junkyard bike didn't stand a chance, but I kept going, rolling past the church, the junior high, then through the Oak Hills neighborhood, all the while racking my brain. If Avery and I were still married, where would we have lived? It wasn't a fair question to ask myself. After all, we had known each other for a little over a year and had only been married 3 days when she died. In this other reality, other me and Avery had been married 10 years. That's a lot of time to know someone. People change, opinions change, circumstances change. I can't understand other me's mind, so all I could do was hope for a miracle. As I was about to turn the corner onto Orchard Drive, I saw a pair of tail lights in a driveway off a side street, Fair Oaks Drive. Of course, I thought, Avery and I talked about renovating an old home on Fair Oaks one day. But man, that was one conversation when we were engaged. Impressive that they pulled it off. My vision was blurry from biking almost a mile downhill in freezing temperature, but as I got closer to the house, I recognized the car to be theirs. I snuck around the back of the house, where I had a view of the living room and kitchen. I smiled looking at the renovated, well, mostly renovated, home. Pictures of Avery and other me lined the walls. There was even an old stand-up piano in the corner, just like the one Avery had always talked about. I found a little slice of heaven. This is everything my life would have been had I acted on that inner voice to pull Avery out of the water 10 years ago. Instead, I'm a depressed bum living with my parents. They made their way into the kitchen and took off their coats. Other me started on the dishes, and Avery sat on the couch, eyes glued to her phone. I figured they were exhausted. It was midnight after all. After a minute, Avery stood up and walked down the hall. I ran to the other side of the house to try and get a view of her, but as I turned the corner, an outdoor security light came on, and I ducked down in some bushes. Other me put the dishes down and walked to the back window to inspect. Then I heard a crash from inside, where Avery was. Other me jerked around, then stopped in his tracks. Go help her, I thought. You cowardly bastard. I returned to my original post in time to see Avery stomping down the hallway and into the kitchen. She was red-hot furious. She walked right up to other me with a piece of paper in her hand. I couldn't hear exactly what she said, but she screamed something and threw the paper at his face. Other me put his hands up as a weak defense. What did you do to Avery this time? As other me tried to explain away whatever was on that paper, Avery grew more furious. She paced to the kitchen and barked something else, then picked up a glass Other Me had been in the middle of washing and threw it across the room, shattering on impact. Who the hell is this woman? Other Me continued to speak calmly in defense, but there was no slowing Avery down. She grabbed a picture off the wall and threw it hard on the ground, the wooden frame crunching. Other Me backed away slowly, moving to the other side of the kitchen island. Then Avery pounced. She ran at him with unrestrained vengeance and shoved him hard against the kitchen cabinets. He held his hands out again, pleading for her to calm down. She grabbed a plate from the sink and swung it at him, but he moved out of the way, and it shattered violently against the cabinets behind him. This only made her madder. She shoved him again, then clawed at his face. Other Me got tangled in his feet and stumbled against the fridge. She slapped him hard against the side of the head, and he yelped in disbelief. Again, he begged for her to stop, but she didn't. She hit him 3 more times in the face while he slumped to the ground. After the third hit, one of his eyes was already swollen shut, and blood was streaming down his face. Avery walked to the other side of the kitchen island, and I breathed an audible sigh of relief. Avery, the girl of my dreams, the girl that made all my friends jealous, the girl I had on a pedestal for the last decade. A monster. I know that we tend to forget people's negative attributes after they've passed, but there was not a violent bone in Avery's body when I knew her. Not even an aggressive one. She was sweet, kind, loving. Not like this. Not at all. What happened to her? As I watched the other bruised and bloodied version of myself weep on the kitchen floor, my world crumbled. All this time I had hated myself for not listening to that voice, for not pulling her out of the pool and saving her life. If only I had done that, we could have gone on to create a beautiful life together, finish school, build careers, buy a house, get a dog. We'd do it laughing and playing the whole time like 2 kids in love. I'd be complete forever. But with that one lapse in judgment, Avery died along with the entire vision for my perfect future. But no, that's not how life would have been. This is how life would have been, with me crying on the kitchen floor with blood running down my face and shattered dishes all around me. Is it possible that my reality, the one I came from, was the better life? There was another crash and a scream from the bedroom. Avery, round 2. She stomped back into the kitchen. Other Me stumbled to his feet. Again, he tried to calmly plead, but again, she wasn't having it. She yelled at him for another minute, then threw a coffee mug at him, shattering against his shoulder. He backed away from her, moving to the back door close to where I was hiding. I ducked down further. The door burst open. Other Me went sprawling past me, tripping and falling into the snow. Avery stopped in the doorway and scoffed. You think you're better off without me, don't you? That's what all this is about, she said. Avery, please, think about what you're doing. Look what you've done to me just now. We cannot keep living like this. I've put up with it for far too long, Other Me said, and stood up. Avery began sobbing quietly, her arms folded tight. Other Me took a step toward her. Don't get any closer to that thing, I thought. You're right. You're so right, Avery said, tears running down her cheeks. God, I'm so horrible to you. You don't deserve this. You deserve someone better, far better, someone who will love you no matter what, no matter. Other Me stayed composed while she cried. Will you ever forgive me? She said. There was a minute of silence. I tried to steady my breathing despite feeling like I was going to explode. Other Me swallowed hard and widened his stance. No, Avery, this is it. I'm doing this. It doesn't mean we're over. It just means I need some time. He turned his back to her and walked to the front of the house where the car was parked. Avery huffed and slammed the back door, returning to the kitchen. I peered my head up and saw her going to the knives next to the stove. I thought about intervening, but didn't know how. She carried a knife to the front door. I ran around the side of the house, past the security light to the front. Other Me had just turned on the car and was starting to back out of the driveway when Avery appeared with the knife. Stop, she screamed at him, trying to block his path. Other Me continued backing out, his eyes growing wide when he saw the massive knife in her hand. Stop this damn car right now, she screamed and tried stabbing one of his tires, but its rotation kicked the knife out of her hand. She quickly picked it up off the driveway. He pulled into the street and sped away, leaving Avery standing in the driveway in her pajama shorts with the giant knife dangling by her side. When the headlights were gone, she dropped the knife and began crying again. My first instinct was to comfort her, an instinct that I quickly overruled. I only watched her in pure bewilderment. Never should have left Texas. After a few minutes, she returned inside, and I could hear her cleaning up the mess. That's when something dawned on me. I made a time capsule because I was about to do something big, something life-changing. For me, I was about to embark on an around-the-world trip. But why would other me make a time capsule? Was he also planning something big? Before I could follow that train any further, I realized that the paper that set Avery off a few minutes before was now sitting in the middle of the driveway. I stood up carefully, making sure I was out of sight, and grabbed it. With my phone as a flashlight, I read the paper. SLC to JFK December 28, JFK to AMS January 4th, AMS to PVG January 12th, PVG to LAX January 19th, LAX to SLC January 23rd. I let the crumpled paper fall to the ground. He was planning the same trip I just came from, which meant he was going to experience what I just experienced. Probably, if he makes it around the world and returns to Salt Lake, he would be stepping into a new reality. If anyone deserves a new reality, it's that guy, so I didn't try to stop him. Lightning struck a tree nearby, knocking me to the ground and killing the power to the rest of Fair Oaks. It began to rain. I walked to Orchard Drive and followed it to Dee's, the only 24-hour diner on this side of town. I'm writing this on a borrowed laptop in a booth that Avery and I had occupied many times when we were younger. I don't know what happened to the reality I came from, if I'm now missing or dead or what. I don't know what will happen to other me when he makes his trip around the world. I don't know if there are other me's planning around the world trips too, thereby disrupting who knows how many more realities. How many other realities are there? Infinite? Frankly, I don't even know what will happen to this post once I publish it. I assume it will be trapped in this reality forever, but who knows how this works. Just a few hours earlier, I smugly thought I had figured out the answer to the embarrassingly juvenile question, is the world round? My cab just got here, so this is the end of the line for me. There are plenty of unanswered questions here. Questions I hope I'll eventually find answers to. All I know now is that I don't like the reality I came from, and I don't like the reality I'm in now, so there's only one way to go. See you in New York, other me. It was a bit of a shock when my grandfather died and didn't leave my dad any of my great-grandfather's things. Most likely, he didn't want to help play into his unhealthy fascination, a decision I and the rest of my extended family greatly appreciated. Anybody to meet my father was quick to encounter his bubbling enthusiasm for the Old West. When I was 7, he took me to the Grand Lake to see Unforgiven, the newest of Clint Eastwood's films. He picked me up from school, grinning like a maniac, in full cowboy gear, complete with an appropriately gaudy pork pie hat. He smacked the side of the car, pretending to spur a horse into action, and looked at me with pointed eyebrows. I always knew what was coming with that look, and he knew that I knew. We inhaled sharply and both let out a booming "Hiya, let's ride." Often my father would draw ire from his cocky manufactured drawl and chronic habit of intimidation. When confronted, he would attribute his Western frontier obsession to his ancestry, a connection to my great-grandfather. A true frontiersman, he would explain. I'm just doing right by him. Obviously, that's a flimsy reason. The truth is, I don't even think he knew why he was so enamored with the idea. No one but my grandfather knew much of anything about the brave settler that was my great-grandfather, not even about the town that he supposedly founded and defended against the last dregs of wickedness plaguing the pre-modernized West. As the story goes, my father was unfazed by my grandfather's refusal to validate his infatuation. He continued to play up his connection to the Old West, even going as far as joining a cowboy reenactment troupe in San Bernardino and amassing a surely world record-winning Old West memorabilia collection. He would often tell progressively dramatized stories about my great-grandfather's supposed adventures on the frontier, even though those who stayed around long enough to hear them were just humoring him. Despite my attempts to regularly spend time with my father, an activity I've learned is impossible to do while also remaining unembarrassed. I felt a rift grow between us as he slips further into delusion, while I become grounded. Slowly, I've started to gain the things that are becoming of a man, a fiance, a dog, a stable, well-paying job, friends, and a too expensive house. Lately, he struck me as just one of those eccentrics you encounter out in the world, which I observed is probably a similar feeling as those who meet him for the first time. In times of vulnerability, I hate myself for thinking that thought. He's my father, not a gimmick. But no matter how much I regretted my disdain for his way of life now, the fact remained that my dad lived a lie, and I didn't. At least, that's what I thought until today. Appearing on my doorstep was a small, worn cardboard box. The corners were stained, and the stench of mold and decay was overpowering. It was obvious that it had been neglected in some damp corner for years, since it was addressed to Nephew Wyatt, and flaunting a P.O. Box return address in Maine. It was probably from my Uncle Howard, who I hadn't seen since his retreat into hermithood after a messy divorce. With suspense, I brought the box inside. No one had heard from Uncle Howard in almost a decade, and suddenly a box from him shows up on my doorstep. I sat down on my couch and gingerly ran scissors through the hasty layers of clear duct tape holding the box closed. Inside was a single journal, beaten and blemished, with a note sitting on top spelling out something that made my heart skip a beat. "Do not show him," scrawled in large, harsh font, stared back at me from the inside of the box. I reached inside and turned the note over to reveal a longer, even more cryptic message in neat cursive. "Dear Wyatt," the note read, "I am afraid I can no longer keep this. When your grandfather entrusted it to me in his will, it was my full intention to keep it safe until my own death. I can no longer bear having it in my possession. It's too much. Please, for his own sake, don't show this to your father. I am afraid he will try to go there, to Whispering Pines. Don't let him go." The note ended there. As I set it down and picked up the tattered journal, I hesitated. There was no doubt in my mind that it would contain something revealing, but that isn't what made me stop. Something I noticed that immediately put a chill through my spine. As I looked up, the lights were off. All of them. I didn't turn them off, and even though it was the middle of the day and the windows were open, the light coming through was dim and muted. The room was shrouded in unnatural, swirling shadows, bent by the noir sunbeams. The silence in the room suddenly sounded loud, as if the entire space was waiting to hear something. I wasn't alone. I was becoming good and paranoid now, my heart beating so fast it could have been trying to tear its way out of my chest and run away. My throat closed, and my eyes subconsciously darted to the darkest corners of the room, expecting something to come racing towards me out of the abyss. My ears filled with the sound of my own heavy, labored breaths. Time started to slow down, and I felt every agonizing second as my mind raced to fight the creeping dread seeping into my every pore. I let out an involuntary whimper. This paranoia seemed manufactured, imposed, but I was falling prey to it and its unseen creator. I couldn't move, not even a tilt of the head. All the anxious thoughts racing through my brain were slowly replaced by a chanting mantra in a voice that didn't match my own. I whispered loudly with a shrill, building urgency, "Come to Whispering Pines." My head was almost filled to the brim with pure panic. The white noise in my ears became louder and louder until even my previously deafening gulps of air were drowned out. A terrifyingly strong pressure pushed on my brain like a migraine. The primal part of me had already accepted death. In this fight or flight moment, my instincts had chosen neither. In what could be my final seconds, my overloaded and overwhelmed brain managed to eke out only a single comprehensible thought. What the hell was happening? Almost to answer my thought, it stopped. The ceiling lights flickered and returned, and the sunlight coming through the window went back to its normal hue. I fell to the floor like a marionette doll. I spent a few moments shocked, terrified to move or look around. I wasn't sure that it was over. Attempting to shake off my clamminess, I stared at the journal I had picked up what seemed like forever ago. Far from providing a distraction, the front cover renewed the fading feeling of foreboding. Then at Wardock, California, 1898. Then at my great-grandfather. The hair on my arm holding the book stood on end. But I was in the stuff now. As far as I was concerned, I needed to commit. I opened the front cover to reveal a faded tintype photo printed on a thin sheet of metal tucked in front of the first page. It pictured a large group of people, the men wearing loose cotton overshirts and chaps, and the women long, patchy dresses with the odd bonnet. They looked beaten up, dirt mudded their faces and hands. They carried a palpable weariness, but were smiling broadly. In the center kneeled a beaming man. That was the spitting image of my grandfather. He wore his age well. His silver hair provided a curious contrast to his lack of wrinkles. The kind brown eyes I recognized were similar to my father's. He was obviously tall, and even while kneeling in front of the group he was higher than their torsos. He held his faded hat to his chest. The backdrop to this old photo was an impossibly dense grove of trees, each trunk practically pressing up against the other. The branches seemed to intermingle and overlap, forming a strong barricade. It almost looked intentional. I flipped the picture. Whispering Pines, 1898, day of arrival. There it was again, that name. I shuddered. I turned the photo back over and began to place it to the side, preparing to read, but I stopped cold. My great-grandfather was the only one remaining in the picture. Every other member of the group was missing. He no longer sported his wide, genuine grin. He was scowling, with squinting, hardened eyes, and looking a decade older. The lack of color didn't put into question that he was covered in blood, practically drenched. Without warning, my great-grandfather's mouth started to move. "Come here, Wyatt," he beckoned. "Come to Whispering Pines." As I watched in horror, the picture started to come alive, the gray drops of blood dripping and pulling at his feet as he stood up and started walking towards the edge of the frame. He grinned again, but it was an impossibly wide smile, a sinister one that reached the edge of his face. I cried out and dropped the picture. This time, though, nothing stopped. He continued his march towards the camera lens, a slow, lurching walk that seemed inhuman. I couldn't tear the photo, I realized. It was made of metal. I sprinted to my kitchen, panting with fear. I need to burn it. I tore through the shelves and cupboards, looking for matches, a lighter, anything. "Wyatt," the voice boomed from the living room. It sounded louder now, more real. I finally came across a dusty butane torch in a cupboard and barreled back to the living room. My shaky hands could barely keep a strong grip on the torch, but I squeezed the button and successfully ignited it. My great-grandfather, or rather some creature that had assumed his image, hadn't reached the front yet, but it was close. Close enough for me to see that its eyes weren't quite right. In each familiar brown eye were two pupils. Kneeling, I pointed the blue flame towards the picture, watching it blacken as the print was erased. It was over. I spent a long time kneeling on that floor in disbelief. The reality of my experience hit me then, and I cried. Some part of me knew that I had left a big piece of myself behind. I stayed on the floor, alternating between stunned silence and regretful tears for hours until I slept. When I awoke, calm, I decided against reading the journal and stowed it back in the box and put it in the garage. For the following week, part of me thought that the worst was behind me. Regardless, the intensity, the vividness of the experience was so raw and horrifying that I've been avoiding looking at pictures for a while. My fiancé is now the designated male retriever. At night I still dream disconcerting dreams. One recurring nightmare I struggle with places me in a wide meadow in a small valley surrounded by trees. I look around and notice that the tree line grows closer when I'm not looking. I try to stop it, spinning around in circles to stop its advancement, but to no avail. The tree line comes nearer and nearer until a ring of evergreens surrounds my body like a cage. I lose my ability to move. My vision goes blurry and dark. I feel a coldness spread throughout my body. I want to grow, to live. I want to reach towards the sun and feed off of its rays. My thoughts become slow and meandering, and my focus wanes. I realize I have become a tree. Recently, I've been feeling strangely compelled to head to the garage, take out the journal, and start reading. This morning, I woke up from the same nightmare sprawled in front of the garage door. I got up and realized that my fingers were bleeding. The door to the garage was locked and painted with bloody scratch marks. A week ago, I was in control of my own life, and now I'm being sucked into a mystery of a waking nightmare. I've cursed Uncle Howard and his selfishness, considered passing it on to my father to attempt to stop the insanity, but a part of me I didn't know was there has steeled itself for what's to come. I don't think it's going to stop until I look over the journal. I haven't gotten a single night of good sleep since I opened Uncle Howard's box. After waking up with raw, bleeding fingers outside of the garage door, I bought cheap but sturdy handcuffs from Party City and started chaining myself to the bedpost in the evening. While I lie there, waiting to slip into another disquieting dream, I can see the journal in my mind's eye, lying quietly in the box in the dark. This morning, while my wrist ached from trying to free itself in the night, and my brow hosted a layer of cold sweat, I sat on the edge of the bed. I was starting to splinter under the weight of the events of the past couple of weeks. I was tired, so damn tired, and the stress was making me question myself if I truly belonged here, in this house, on this bed. Everything felt wrong, fake, as if I had crossed into a world where I no longer had any agency. I've probably never had any anyway. In my formative years, I fibbed constantly, little lies like adding a half point to my GPA in conversation, or buying expensive sneakers during the holiday season to pretend I had gotten normal gifts and not adjustable suspenders. The fibs eventually became flat-out falsifications, glimpses into my ideal reality where my father was a father and not a low-functioning alcoholic, where I was going to turn out okay and not just like him. My obsession with normalcy spiraled. I spent weeks filling out cursive workbooks at night in order to scribble convincing notes from my mother and my lunches. I love you. Have an amazing day, they would say. Have fun at school. I'd scoff and make a show of throwing it away. Much too early to correct, I started eating away at myself. The guilt gnawed at me. The regret that I couldn't will my fictions into existence eroded my ambition. The comfort of evading shame from outside judgment won instead of the comfort of self-respect. I brought the habit into my adulthood, too. I tell imaginary stories, conjure surface-level problems to seem relatable, and create comfy characters to fill the gaping hole. I hold opinions that aren't mine, espouse convictions without conviction. Even before the journal surfaced on my doorstep, I would watch my fiancé sleep and feel a deep, sinking shame because I was a collection of lies, a bundle of wishes on shooting stars, and she might never know how truly far apart we were. But then, where does the journal fit? It seemed fated, a day I had been waiting for, or a destiny unrealized. Perhaps it's the way out, a path to redemption. Yes, keeping it in my garage, hiding it. What if that was the wrong answer? Yes, that's an opportunity for change. To start over and start to write a new narrative, one where I don't get scared by what I don't understand. To forge my own fate. Yes, yes, yes. Steeled with this newfound conviction, I rose from the bed with a strength and purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. I strolled, almost gliding, to the garage door, passively noticing that it was no longer locked. I wrapped my hand around the knob and pushed, revealing a pitch-black room. It was strangely dark, as if it was nullifying all of the light that tried to spread inside. I reached my hand in to turn the light switch on. A dry tut emanated from a sinister, raspy voice somewhere in the garage. Part of me expected something like this to happen, but that expectation accomplished nothing in the face of the wave of shivers exploding throughout my body. I'm going to have my damn way for once, I thought. Oh yes, Wyatt, you can have your way. Yes, the voice hissed. I jumped, because your way is my way. A loud, hacking chortle pierced the blackness. What does that mean? I waited. Silence. I reached my hand further into the dark and cursed the distance the light switch was from the doorway. I strained my arm, stretching it as far as it could go, trying to limit the amount my left half was exposed to the sticky blackness of the garage. My fingers groped for the switch. I'd spent a lot of time in this room, clearing the previous owner's hoard of antique 1980s furniture. I knew where the light was, and I never remembered it being this far. In the murky shadow I searched, waiting for the hoarse, unnatural voice to break the silence. You don't think, Wyatt, the voice jeered. I do your thinking for you. There it was. I found it. I fumbled, but finally got a two-finger grip on the switch and pulled it up. To my surprise, the light actually turned on. It illuminated a cramped, but otherwise undisturbed room, the owner of the voice not visible. I stepped through the threshold and towed, still on edge, to the corner of the garage. Next to a veritable pile of paint cans stood the box, small, but teeming with malice, practically pulsating. I felt a warm breeze hit my ear. It tickled, like a fly had grazed against it. I reached down towards the box, arms extended. My ear twitched again, the same feeling. I froze. I recognized what that breeze was from years of sleeping next to someone. It was breathing. Something outside of my peripheral view was breathing wetly into my ear. I could smell it now, putrid and sour, reeking of rotting meat. Why do you think you came in here? It gurgled. It's because I made you. You didn't make me do anything, I squeaked. Those thoughts that brought you into this room, Wyatt, they are mine, not yours. I am the one who put them there. I felt a long, slender hand run through my hair, sloughing off what I can only assume was chunks of soft, decaying flesh, exposing the bone, which started to scratch my scalp painfully. I groaned in pain. Poor Wyatt. No mommy, no daddy, it shrieked gleefully, but so much doubt. The voice erupted into shrill, unhinged giggling. I felt a cold wetness dribble on my ear. Drool. A drop of blood from my raw scalp plopped on the floor. We were in a standstill. It was waiting for me to do something, say something, and I was afraid of what its response would be. My thoughts whirled with uncontrollable fears, drawing a picture of this invisible monster. In my mind, it was slender and tall, leathery gray shriveled skin with long, rangy appendages, and a hunched back, leaning ever closer with beady black eyes, and an eerie sharp-toothed grin, flesh caught in its blackened teeth. This image petrified me. There was nothing more terrifying than that. There was a brief moment where two warring forces in my soul stopped fighting and looked at me. It was a beautiful pause, one where the evil around me ceased to exist. It made sense. It made so much sense in that moment. Of course, that's how it was. My facilities slowly returned, and I laughed heartily. Booming, it echoed in the garage, bouncing off the walls and doubling, tripling in magnitude. It didn't quite sound like me, an edge that I had never noticed twinging my echo. It makes so much sense. I sprung into action, leaping over to the pile of paint cans and grabbing one of the thin handles with two hands. I blindly swung the can with my full weight. Right before the climax of the swing, I saw it out of the corner of my eye, and I was right. It wasn't as scary as I imagined. Nowhere close. Thunk. I hit it hard. The creature, which was at the very least much smaller than I expected it to be, burst into a busy cloud of, what was that? Pine needles. Without so much as a whimper, I stood amid the gently falling needles, drinking in my real and symbolic victory and the fresh aroma of the trees. I got to thinking, it makes sense. Every single frightening event that's happened since the journal came has been just that. Scary, not dangerous or life-threatening, only taking advantage of my shortcomings, fears, and uncertainty. That realization gave me relief. My intuition had been screaming at me each time I faced those somethings. The photograph, the nightmares, the creature in the garage, that I was going to die without any doubt. Maybe that was no longer true. There was not much else to do but get to the reason I came to the garage. In the first place, I plodded back to the corner where the box lay. I stared at it for a few beats, drunk in its innocence, and briefly lamented the loss of mine. Somberly, I pulled it open. The journal was still there, and I wasted no time. Anticipating some horrifying event, I flipped the cover and turned to the first page. The cursive was hard to make out at first. It was like no handwriting I'd ever seen before. Instead of the swirling, uniform script I had studied as a child, the leading and trailing lines of each letter were connected, independent of the word. It had a closed system circle from the beginning of the letter. Each other letter was similarly cryptic. I slowly started translating. The first word, objects, it wasn't English. It wasn't even a language I recognized. My great-grandfather was American. He spoke English, so why was his journal in another tongue? I turned to the next page to see if it was the same pseudo-language. It was blank. Blank. What? I kept flipping through the pages. They were all empty. I sat, looking at the first page, staring at the psychedelic font, expecting the puzzle pieces to somehow come together and reveal some hidden meaning. I was on the garage floor for a long time, until the lack of sunlight filtering through the cloudy glass in the garage door jerked me from my trance. I took one last hard look at the mystifying passage, trying to will something forward. An answer, perhaps. Suddenly, the words on the first page started to leak. The ink sump, cloudy, and expanding, slowly taking over the page until the entire sheet of paper was the darkest shade of black. Only one word remained in the very center of the page, one that wasn't there before, in perfect English cursive. Newcomer. The word disappeared, completing the page's transformation into an empty, striking darkness. It hit me with the same dread as the bottom of the ocean, or the depths of a pit would, something unknowable and unescapable. It began pulling at me then. I couldn't take my eyes off the page, and my hands and arms moved on their own, lifting it closer to my face, closer and closer, until I couldn't see anything but the void. My eyes closed and opened, but saw the same nothingness. And among all of this fascinating melancholy, I hardly noticed that I was losing consciousness. The tugging didn't quell. No, I was being led somewhere through the dark, somewhere I wanted to go, and I was about to find out where. I used to love driving late at night. The almost completely empty roads, lit only by the white and yellow glow of the streetlights, along with the darkened houses and accompanying silence, only broken by the noise of my car's engine and tires, always used to fill me with a sort of serenity. It was a way to unwind and try and forget about the world as it was in the daytime, along with all the problems that came with the eternal rise of the sun. It was my own personal form of therapy and meditation, and it never failed to get me to sleep peacefully when I eventually returned home. Well, that's how it used to be anyways, up until a few days ago. To give you guys a little bit of context, before I tell you what happened, I live in a moderately sized coastal town in the Pacific Northwest. I won't say exactly where, as I don't want anyone brave enough, or stupid enough for that matter, to try and replicate the exact conditions of my experience in hopes of testing it for themselves. I don't want anyone else to have to go through what I did that night. But, safe to say, while it is a rather beautiful place in terms of scenery, it's also, in a way, rather forgotten about. Up until about the mid to late 80s, it was home to a bustling logging industry which, along with the local fishing port, was the town's lifeblood since the beginning of the 20th century, accounting for a large percentage of its residents' income. But when it was shut down in the early 90s due to arguments about some endangered species of owl that resided in the surrounding forest, the town just sort of dried up. It still attracts some tourists during the summertime, which supplants some of the lost income, but it never fully recovered from losing its biggest industry. It's still more or less frozen in time, as it was 30 some odd years ago. I was writing out my shopping list for the next day that night. It was the last day of the month, and because of an ingrained routine from growing up with my mother, I always bought all the non-food essentials I needed for the month on the 1st. That was when I remembered something which had slipped my mind, and I slapped my forehead lightly. "You idiot, you forgot to gas up earlier," I swore under my breath, then looked at the clock that hung over my kitchen sink. According to it, it was just past 11, I think around 11:15. Or 11:20. I bit my bottom lip and debated about what to do. I don't like getting gas in the morning due to everyone all over town seeming to have the exact same idea at the same exact time, and packing into the station like they're a tin of sardines. I knew that there was at least one gas station near my apartment which stayed open all night, which, for the moment anyways, was still under $2.40 a gallon. Ah, damn it, I muttered to myself, pushing the pad of paper away and standing up from the table. I was feeling a bit restless. Anyways, a late night drive, even for just a few minutes, would help me relax. Pulling on my sneakers and jacket, I grabbed my car keys off their hook and stepped outside. The late February air was colder that night than it had been all winter, and it stunned my face as I walked down the stairs and crossed the parking lot to my car, noting with vague interest that there was no moon showing tonight, just the stars, an occasional brighter flicker of a satellite. Unlocking the door, I had to pull on the handle a couple times as ice had formed and frozen it shut. Finally, it opened, and I slid behind the wheel, jamming the key into the ignition and starting the engine. After a few minutes of running the defroster, combined with having to get back out and use a scraper to rid the windshield of some rather stubborn frost which refused to melt, I pulled out of the parking lot and onto the street. My neighborhood, like most of the rest of town, had already gone to bed. I only saw a few yellow glows from people's windows that indicated there were others burning the late night oil with me. After a few turns, I pulled into the bright lights of the gas station. Rolling my window down, I pulled two 20s out of my pocket and turned the car off. We still have many full service stations in our area, meaning you're not allowed to get out of your car and pump your own gas. You have to have the attendant fill it for you. He was talking to someone in a minivan, so I patiently waited for him to spot me. After a few seconds, he came over to me, shaking his head slightly. "Sorry, I can't sell you gas right now, man." He gestured back towards the pump. "The computers are down for some reason. I've had to turn away everyone who's pulled up for the last 15 minutes. I felt my heart sink a little at his words. "Any idea when they'll be back up?" I asked, hoping he'd give me a solid answer, but he simply shook his head again. "I honestly don't know. It could be 15 minutes, could be half an hour." He gave the pumps a look of disgust. "I knew connecting the pumps to computers would be a bad idea," he murmured. I grunted in reply, not really knowing how to respond to him. He looked down at me and shrugged, then slapped the roof of my car and began walking back to his booth in between the pumps. "Try coming back in about half an hour and seeing if we're back online again," he called, stepping inside and sliding the door closed behind him. "Damn," I muttered to myself, rolling my window back up and turning the key until the glowing green lights of my car's digital dash came on. According to the gas gauge, I had just about a quarter of a tank left. My car is a 30-year-old Crown Vic, and if you don't daily drive an older car, let me tell you something. A quarter of a tank really does not last in something that gets 11 to 13 miles per gallon in town. I slapped the steering wheel and let out another damn, trying to figure out my options. I could simply stay and wait to see if the computers fixed soon, but there was no guarantee of that. And after seeing how annoyed the attendant had been, I really didn't want to become the new focus of his bad mood. But what else can I possibly do? This was the only gas station I had been to at night before, and I really didn't know if any of the others in town were still open at this time. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard, which now read 1:15 midnight. For a brief moment, I thought about simply heading back home and just accepting having to deal with the lines at the pump the next day. It would be a major irritation, but it wouldn't be the end of the world. But then I shook my head. I can at least check to see if any of the other stations are open and working before I give up, I thought. Nodding in agreement with myself, I started the car and pulled out of the station. I wish to God I had just given up and not been so persistent. I circled back around through my neighborhood until I drove across an intersection and onto a side road. The road ahead would wind through a few other neighborhoods and a brief but thickly wooded area before emptying out into the other side of town, and it would save me a few minutes overtaking the main road. I traveled down it, passing only a single house that had a light on inside. As I pulled up to a stop sign, I thought for a second that my windshield was beginning to fog up again. "Are you freaking kidding me?" I muttered, reaching over to flick on my defroster again. When I stopped, I looked at my windshield and out of it for a minute, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. It took a few seconds, but then I realized what I was seeing. Crap, it's ground fog. I got caught out in ground fog. Now, if you've never dealt with ground fog, let me tell you that it's more than a little jarring to drive through, not to mention dangerous. If you've seen movies where a ship gets caught up in a fog bank and can barely see what's in front of them, take that, and then imagine trying to drive a car through it. You can easily lose track of the yellow median lines when it gets thick enough and accidentally drive off the road and wreck. I slowed down to about 5 miles an hour below the speed limit, but I kept going, still not wanting to admit defeat, even though I knew I was putting myself at risk. I've always had the misfortune of being hard-headed and stubborn, and once again, it was keeping me from doing the smart move and turning around. I passed by through the second neighborhood, glancing out at the windshield, at the houses, and parked cars steadily becoming enshrouded in the thick white fog. For some reason, the view gave me a bit of an uneasy feeling. It was like looking at a version of something you recognize, but through the lens of a dream, making it feel unfamiliar at the same time. I shook my head to focus back on the road. Don't let your imagination run away with itself. Bro, you need to keep your wits about you. The second neighborhood fell away behind me, and I entered the section that was the most dangerous. This part had absolutely no streetlights, and I slowed ever further down, not wanting to accidentally hit a deer, or hell, a homeless person who might wander out onto the road. I fully admit, as I drove through this part, only passing by 1 or 2 houses, and clenching the steering wheel as I stared out, able to actually see my headlight beams leading the way in front of me. My mind began to conjure up images from both my nightmares and horror movies I've watched. I imagined ghostly pirates from a John Carpenter film jumping out of the tree line to slash at my passing car, or some glowing-eyed monster to leap from the trees. Basically, I succeeded in scaring the absolute hell out of myself when I exited the darkness and drove back into the final neighborhood before heading down a hill to the other side of town. I let out a huge sigh of relief, deciding I would take the main road back, longer or not. As I came to a stop at the intersection of the main road, I glanced left and right and noticed something odd. As I said before, one reason I used to love driving late at night in my town was the almost completely empty streets. Emphasis on the word almost, even at what my car's dashboard clock now indicated. As 5 past midnight, there would always be 1 or 2 cars driving on the main roads, from people working the late night or graveyard shifts on their way home or to work, not to mention the cops that patrolled late at night. But now, as I looked around and strained my eyes to try and catch the glimpse of headlights or taillights through the fog, I saw nothing, not a single trace of another human being. I shook my head and crossed the intersection onto another side street, shrugging. But inside, I began to feel that uneasy feeling which had come over me on the darkened road return. It wasn't gnawing at me, almost shooed away by the streetlights passing overhead and momentarily illuminating the car's interior the way a child's imaginary monster might be frightened away by a night light, but it still lay just beneath my skin. I passed by the hulking shape of our town's mall on my right, and then up to the curb beside the Safeway next to it. From here, I could see the lit-up gas station on the far end of its parking lot, which, for some reason, was surrounded by yellow tape. God damn it, are you kidding me? Apparently, it was closed for some sort of maintenance, which was exactly my luck. I glanced down at my car's gas gauge, which now read just below a quarter of the tank, and rubbed my eyes. Sighing, I put the car back in drive and turned back onto the main road. There was one final place I wanted to check, a gas station 2 blocks up. Please be open, please, for the love of all that is holy, be open, I quietly prayed, hoping my plea would be heard. However, as I crossed a bridge, I saw that it would not be answered. The darkened shape of it came rapidly up on me, then passed by and disappeared back into the ether that surrounded everything just as quickly. Damn it, I muttered, slumping back into my seat as I stopped at another red light. I sighed and shrugged my shoulders in defeat. Alright, I officially give up. This isn't gonna happen tonight. Time to head back home. I passed by the sign for the bowling alley, the building itself completely obscured by the white veil around it, and turned right at the next intersection, which led up the highest hill in town. As the car climbed, the uneasy feeling I had stayed with me. For the first time in a while, I disliked the silence. I wished that my car's speakers hadn't blown out a few months ago, as the radio would have been a welcome distraction from it. Cresting the hill, I navigated my way through another neighborhood until I came to another main road, this one which would lead me straight back to my side of town and home. I turned onto it, glad that I would be in my bed in a few minutes as I passed by a dark and empty park on my left. I'd deal with everything else tomorrow. As I drove down a hill, I finally spied another sign of life. Down a side street to my right, seen for just a split second, I saw the outline of a person standing on a sidewalk. It was too quick and too foggy to make out any details, but just knowing I wasn't alone out here made me feel a little better, even if it was likely a homeless person wandering around. That feeling lasted about another 20 seconds, until I reached the next intersection. I remember I blinked a few times as if what I saw in front of me would disappear like a hallucination, and just up and settle out. What the actual hell? With an absolute feeling of confusion coming over me. Every road in our town, even the main ones, have those stereotypical metal poles at the intersections, with the green signs on top, telling you what streets you're approaching in which direction. The ones I was looking at were not the ones that should have been there. Instead, they were the ones for an intersection I had gone through to get to the closed gas stations. I shook my head and glanced around, where I felt another pang of surprise rip through me. Instead of the auto zone across the street, the Rite Aid off to my left, and the sandwich shop to my right, I saw the convenience store and houses that stood around the other intersection. Feeling my head spin lightly, I pulled into the empty parking lot of the store and put the car in park. I pulled my glasses off my face and rubbed my eyes, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Am I really that tired? I thought to myself, I've gotta be, and this fog is not helping. I'd had moments before where I'd been so tired, I'd sort of drifted into autopilot mode and snapped back to find myself somewhere else. So I simply chalked it up to another of these moments. I slapped my cheeks lightly to try and perk myself up, then spoke aloud to try and focus. Okay, time to get home on the double. Man, this is dangerous now. I pulled back out of the parking lot and drove towards the mall and the Safeway. A minute later, both passed by, the station still lit up and surrounded by the yellow tape. I turned right and drove down the road again, passing by the second closed gas station and the bowling alley. Following the path I'd sworn I'd done before, I turned up the hill, made my way through the neighborhood, and came out onto the main road. This time, I looked up at the street signs to make sure I was where I wanted to be. I saw with a sense of satisfaction that I was, indeed, on the right one. I turned onto the road and noted the park on my left, as well as the church looming out of the blanket of fog. As I drove down the hill, I glanced to my right again. The intersection whizzed by, but again, I saw the outline of a person standing a few blocks down the road in that split second. I murmured aloud. Maybe it's not a homeless person after all. Maybe it's someone up late going out for a cigarette break. The thought, again, made me feel somewhat better, and then it burst like a balloon pricked by a needle as I came to a stop. My eyes widened, and I felt my breath clench in my chest as I stared at the street sign. It can't be. It absolutely can't be. But it was. It was the intersection. The same damn intersection. I sat there, my foot on the brake as I attempted to understand. I knew for a fact that I hadn't drifted off this time, and I had kept careful watch of the streets I had taken. There was absolutely no freaking way I was back here. The two roads had no connecting links to each other. Hell, they were almost a mile apart. This makes no sense, I said as I leaned my forehead on my hand. I glanced down at my dash and saw that I'd lost a bar on the fuel gauge, spiking my stress further as I looked to the right to look at the distance. To empty. It read 20 miles. Swallowing hard, I let out my breath in a whoosh. Okay, get a hold of yourself. You're alright. Keep a grip. Don't panic, I whispered to myself. I hoped that my own voice would provide me some comfort and stability, but it didn't seem to help much. I looked around me and saw the same store and houses, then pulled away from the intersection. The mall and Safeway passed by again, but when I came to the intersection, I turned left instead of right. This road should lead me back to a main road, which intersected with the one I'd twice attempted to get to. As I pulled onto the road, I pushed down on the accelerator just a little bit harder, almost as if to will myself straight to the end. The speedometer crept up to 40, as a billboard for the local hardware store hanging over the street whipped overhead and disappeared behind me. I knew I shouldn't be going so fast with such limited visibility, but as much as my brain was trying to rationalize what was happening, cold shivers were beginning to climb up my spine, and then they climaxed as the exact same sign came into view and went past. What? There is no way that just happened. There is only one of those signs in town, and there is no way that just... My thoughts came to a halt as I slammed on the brakes, the rear wheels locking up and sending the car into a slight skid. It came to a halt, and I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. I was back at the same intersection. I put both of my hands to my forehead, then slammed the steering wheel. What the hell is going on? I shouted, my voice slamming back into my ears in the enclosed space. I stopped and took a deep breath, then let it out. Shouting was not going to help my situation, no matter how messed up it was. I thought for a second, then turned right and onto the street which I had driven down twice now. I had a plan concocting in my head, and I hoped to God it would work. I followed the same path that I had before, turning up the hill and back out onto the main road. As I did, I kept looking at the houses I passed, wishing silently that I would see one with its lights on, but they all remained dark. The streetlights no longer seemed as comforting as they once did. They almost feel like beacons, alerting something to my presence. I started as I turned onto the main road again. Where the hell had that thought come from? Pushing it away, I slowed as I passed by the park and church until I came to the intersection I was looking for. A smile of relief crossed my face as I turned onto the side street and pulled to the curb. Putting the car in park, I stared down the street at exactly what I'd been hoping to see. The person I'd previously seen standing on the curb 2 or 3 blocks down was still standing there. Thank you, God, for small favors. I opened the door and stepped out of the car, stretching slightly from the slight cramp of sitting in it for so long. The second I did, I shivered at the chill that the fog brought with it. Pulling the collar of my coat up to try and protect myself somewhat from it, I left the engine running and stepped forward, squinting my eyes to try and see the person more clearly. Whoever it was stood just beyond a street lamp at the head of a house's walkway, draped in shadow. From this distance, I couldn't tell which direction they were facing or make out any features. To see if they were looking my way, I raised my hand and gave a light wave. No response. Must be looking the other way, then, I thought. Glancing back at my car for a second, I began to walk forward, choosing to stay in the middle of the street where the streetlights illuminated the most. As I came within a block of the person, I cleared my throat, hoping I wouldn't have to raise my voice and accidentally wake anyone sleeping up. The person still didn't respond. Great, I whispered under my breath, then bracing myself, I raised my voice slightly. Excuse me. Silence. Excuse me. I said a little louder. I need some help. Still nothing. I began to feel a little irritated, as I knew I was speaking loudly enough for them to hear me. I took a few steps forward. Hey, buddy, I said, I need a little help here. The figure stayed where it was, not giving any indication of acknowledgement. I gritted my teeth and stopped giving a damn about waking anyone up, feeling all the negative emotions from the night take over me as I began to stride forward. Okay, look, I've had one hell of a night, and I don't know why the insult died in my throat and my voice trailed off as I came to a sudden stop. The uneasy feeling I'd had before washed back over me, now accompanied by something else. Fear, a sense of fear so strong that it sent a colossal shiver up my spine, one that felt primal and instinctive. Something's not right. I knew exactly what my thought had meant. No person, short of being completely deaf, should be this unresponsive to questions or insults. As my anger and irritation fell away, I realized every muscle in my body was tensed up. I also suddenly realized something else which made my fear rise slightly. In the silence, I should have been able to hear the person breathing or shuffling around to stay warm, but there was nothing but silence. I was suddenly overcome with a feeling that I should leave, right to hell now, and that whoever or whatever that figure was, I didn't want to see it. I slowly began to step backwards, trying to make as little noise as I could. That's when the figure moved. I froze as I heard a wet, sliding sound come from its direction. I couldn't tell what it had come from, and I didn't want to know. I was beginning to shake slightly, more from fear than the cold, and then it slowly began to turn. All reason left me, and I whirled around and began to dash back towards my car. I didn't dare look behind me to see what was happening. All focus was on powering me to my escape. I reached for and snatched the handle, yanking the door open and jumping inside. Just as I began to slam it closed, I heard the sound which still wakes me up in the middle of the night, sheets stained with sweat. I heard the beginnings of a laugh, but not one which could have come from any human. This sound was at the same time dry as paper and wet as rain, croaking and filled with more malice and evil than I have ever heard in my life. And then my door was shut, and I was fumbling for the gear shifter, yanking it down from park into reverse so hard I thought I would break it for a second. The tires screamed as I jammed my foot down onto the accelerator, and the car flew backwards into the empty intersection. I glanced up only for a split second as I put the car into drive to turn the wheel. And, God, do I wish I never had, because what I saw will haunt me until the day I die. The figure was still in shadow beyond the streetlight, but I knew that it was facing towards me now, because I could see its eyes, its gold and red glowing eyes. I screamed the loudest scream I ever have let out in my life, as I slammed my foot onto the accelerator, the rear of the car breaking loose and sliding out behind me before the tires caught the pavement and shot me forward. The engine roared as I kept my foot hard down, no longer caring about hitting anything at all. All I knew was that I had to get away. The car left the road for a moment as it dropped down into a hill before slamming back to earth. Still, I kept my foot to the floor. As I watched the speedometer rapidly climb towards 60, I kept all my attention on the road in front of me to keep the car in a straight line. The lights whipped over my head, the wind whipping past the windows, and then I flew past the park again. No, I moaned out as the church flew past as well. I could see the intersection coming up again, but I didn't dare look down the side street again. I just kept my foot to the floor as it whizzed by. The speedometer rose to 80, and I spared a split-second glance at the gas gauge. "Oh God," was all that could wheeze out from between my lips. Somehow, in the span of time from my last turn around, so much gas had been used up that there were only 2 bars left. The distance to empty read 10 miles. No, I began bleeding out like a mantra as the park again came into view. I refused to lift my foot, but this time, I shot a glance to the right. As the intersection flew by, my fears were confirmed. As with the split-second glance I had showed that the thing was now closer to the main road than it had been before. All the streetlights on the road having gone out, the speedometer was now at 90, and tears began to fall from my face as the park, church, and side street kept flying by over and over again, disappearing and reappearing in the fog like a hellish vintage film background. Each time it repeated, it was closer and closer. When I passed by it again, it was standing at the very edge of the intersection, so close that I could hear its laughter filter through my closed windows and over the roar of my engine. As I looked down and saw the speedometer break 100 miles an hour, I glanced up to see it standing in the middle of the intersection. The lights in it had gone out, and all I could still see was its glowing eyes. Screaming again, I jerked the wheel to the right, almost sending the car into a spin. The headlights for a moment illuminated the demonic visage hidden in the fog and darkness, and if they had stayed a microsecond longer, my mind would have broken. Even now, I can't recall the exact details. It feels like my head will split in half if I try to, but the car barely missed it, and I heard the sound of its laughter change into a cry of rage, of indignation. I felt something strike the left rear of the car, and I fumbled to keep it on the road. Glancing in the rear view mirror, I saw the gold and red eyes disappear into the fog, and I felt the tears flow freely from my eyes, as I knew I couldn't avoid it a second time. In my head, I made the decision that if I saw everything pass by again, I would aim straight for the thing this time. If I was going out, I sure as hell was going to try and take it with me. I braced myself to see the park and church again. However, I was filled with shock when I saw the sign for the auto zone light up the intersection in front of me. What was all I could manage out as I flew through the intersection and past it, and the Rite Aid, and the sandwich shop. I glanced down at the dash and saw I was doing 110 as the Walmart flew by on my left. Was this a trick? The answer came as I saw the lights of the gas station I had left flicker through the lifting fog. Yes, the ground fog was beginning to lift. I began to laugh, softly, still crying as I let my foot off the accelerator. My laugh sounded almost insane as I braked and pulled back into the gas station. I put the car in park and turned the engine off, my body shaking uncontrollably. I buried my face in my hands until a rap on the window caused me to shriek out and fumble for the keys. "It's here." It was a trick. It wasn't. It was the attendant. He motioned for me to roll my window down, and I slowly did. "Hey, you got back here just in time. The computers are back." He stopped as he caught sight of the state of me. "Hey, are you okay, buddy?" he asked gently, putting a hand on the door sill. What could I possibly say? If I told him the truth, as much as I wanted, he'd never believe me. Hell, I wouldn't have believed me unless I'd just gone through what I had. I wiped my eyes with the sleeve of my jacket and pulled out the 220s I had, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "Yeah," I stammered a bit, "just had a near miss on the road, scared the hell out of me." I held out the money to him. "Can I just get $40 of regular, please?" He took the money, still looking hard at me, then looked at the rear of my car. "Looks like you had more than just a near miss," he finally said. I stared at him in confusion, and he gestured for me to get out of the car and look. I stepped out on shaky legs, and thankfully had the door to grab onto, as they almost gave out on me as I saw what he'd meant. Dug into the left rear quarter panel of the car, just behind the gas cap, were 3 rips in the metal. They were deep and evenly spaced apart. No, not rips, I realized as I stared at them. Claw marks. I kept staring at them as the attendant filled my car up, then snapped out of it as he handed me my receipt, giving me a last hard look as he did. As I turned to get back in the car, he called out one final thing: try not to drive in the fog again. I've seen too many people get taken by it. I turned back to ask him what he meant, but he'd already shut the door to his booth. Now it's a few days later. I know I'll never understand what I stumbled upon or what that thing was. And frankly, I don't want to. I already deal with enough nightmares from the little I experienced. Nor do I know how I got away. When I see the ground fog roll in now, like I did last night, I close my blinds up tight and stay inside. And I will never drive late at night again. I won't tell you not to, but if you do, please be careful. And whatever you do, don't drive when the ground fog rolls in. Stan and I met shortly after I moved to Seattle in the spring of 2017. We used to joke that we should make up some sort of meet cute to explain the origins of our relationship, because the truth was far less romantic and far more mundane. That is, we met on Tinder, as everyone seems to these days. To say we hit it off would be an understatement. He seemed like the perfect man for me. He loved dogs, just like I did, and music, and art. Of course, there were some things we didn't agree on. He liked horror movies way more than me, for instance, and snakes. He tried to convince me multiple times that we should get a snake. That was one I knew from the beginning I was never budging on. They just give me the creeps, you know. Things like that felt like they just added depth to our relationship. Though, we moved quickly, not overwhelmingly fast, but a bit quicker than I normally moved in relationships. It just really felt like he got me. I found myself spilling far more details about my ex than I had intended on ever sharing on our third date. I was half expecting him to run for the hills then. My ex wasn't the very kind guy, if you get my drift, and crying on a third date is never sexy. He just reached out, took my hand, and told me we all go through dark stuff. I felt heard. And who hasn't had a messed up ex? He asked, offering me a wry smile. A few months later, we were moving in together. Things were perfect. At first, anyways. Even then, it was just small things, really. It wasn't long before Stan sat me down to talk to me about how I kept forgetting to do my dishes. For example, I couldn't help but feel a little defensive. That particular week, I'd worked double shifts 2 days in a row. I'd barely even had time to sleep, much less address the dishes. Still, I conceded. He wasn't wrong, after all. After that, I realized that my clothes were a bit too revealing. Following Stan pointing it out, I still felt a little defensive, but he assured me he was just trying to look out for me. Since this was my first time out on my own, he had several years of experience on me on that matter, so I pushed down my pride and agreed. He was just trying to help, you know, just like he was when he pointed out that my friends weren't that great of an influence and that going out on the weekends wasn't really fair to him. Besides things like that, our relationship was great, really. We had countless happy photos together. He was never shy about posting me. The long, romantic captions he'd post alone quelled any doubts I had about how much he cared about me. Silly, I know, but it felt nice that someone was proud to show me off. For our 1-year anniversary, Stan suggested we go on a trip. He said I could pick, so I suggested a national park I'd always wanted to see, Joshua Tree to be specific. We both enjoyed camping and the outdoors, so it seemed like a safe choice. When I suggested it, though, I saw his gaze darken. That was Emma's favorite park, he said. Emma was his ex, the messed up one he'd alluded to on our third date. He didn't talk about her much. I always got the impression that he didn't want to think about that part of his life much. So, I didn't ask. As such, I didn't know much beyond how she was some sort of biologist, and apparently 50 shades of insane. They dated for a few years right after she'd graduated college, and then she'd went entirely off the rails. Never mind, I amended quickly. What about Glacier National Park then? It's supposed to be really pretty too, and it's closer. His face relaxed, and he smiled. That's much better, he agreed. Glacier it is. I was really excited about our trip. I was taking a whole week off work. I poured God knows how many hours into planning. I wanted it to be perfect, to really show Stan how grateful I was that he'd managed to put up with me for a year. The trip grew steadily closer, and before I knew it, we were climbing into his car, the trunk full of camping gear, and his dog, Penelope, panting happily. We lived about 10 hours away from Glacier. Not horribly far, but definitely far enough to warrant the planning I'd put in. The road trip there was nice, for the most part, aside from how I forgot to remind Stan to fill up the gas tank. That was a close call. We left early in the morning, early enough that I thought it counted more as late at night. To be honest, by the time we were arriving at Glacier, the shadows were growing long, surrounded by gold. We'd have just enough time to set up our camp, I thought. We went to check in at the ranger station. Stan did the talking, while I pet Penelope behind him. I listened in on the conversation. It was mostly park guidelines, typical stuff like that. Stan, of course, was also chatting with the ranger like they were old friends. He was always charismatic like that. We figured we'd head out here to celebrate. Isn't that right, dear? Stan asked, turning to me. I nodded quickly. Yep. Can't believe it's been a year already, I said. The ranger, a youngish man with dark blonde hair tied back in a ponytail, looked past Stan to meet my gaze. That's wonderful. Congratulations, he said. He wouldn't happen to have any recommendations for things to do, would you? Stan asked, shifting his weight so he stood in front of me. I almost opened my mouth to say I already had things we could do planned out. I had for nearly 2 months. I decided against it. Stan had told me recently that I tended to come across as bossy and condescending, and I was trying to work on that. Instead, I turned my attention back to Penelope as the ranger went over some trails and interpretive programs. Eventually, Stan shook his hand and we headed to our campsite. I was reading about some trails we could try, I offered, as we set up. Oh, don't worry about that, Stan said. I'm sure he just gave us more in-depth info than whatever research you read. Right, I mumbled. The first night there was peaceful. We built a campfire. At one point, Stan dropped Penelope's leash. She ran over to the nearest campsite. Luckily, the couple there thought she was just as adorable as we did. Stan invited them over to join us around the campfire. I was a little disappointed. I had pictured getting up early to head out on the hikes he'd suggested I plan a few months ago, and it had already been a long day of travel. Still, plans change. The couple was incredibly friendly. On the bright side, the girl was named Marie and the guy Michael. They had been traveling in their van for the past 6 months. You know, I always thought van life sounded like it would be amazing. Of course, we have her holding us down, Stan said, laughing towards me. It was hard enough to get away from work this week, I agreed, playing along. Well, a week out here is better than nothing, Marie offered. The next day, we headed out on one of the hikes Stan had chosen, getting up a bit later as I had guessed would happen. It was pretty, I'll admit, and I was beginning to feel silly for being so controlling over what we did. When we returned to camp that night, we had dinner at the nearby restaurant, and things felt like they were going nicely. This was the longest we'd gone in weeks without some sort of argument, or me messing something up. After dinner, we stopped by the visitor center to buy some more firewood. When we returned, Marie and Michael came over again, not to chat, though. This time, they had a question for us, or more, for Stan. Michael tried to keep his voice down as he asked Stan if he'd heard anything strange last night, as Marie had been spooked by something. I surmised they were trying to not scare me as well, though I thought that was rather silly. We were in the woods, after all. It seemed like weird noises were to be expected. Stan and I climbed into our tent that night, and sleep took us both quickly. It didn't keep its grasp, though, at least not on me. I was awoken at some point in the night by something outside our tent. My first thought was that it was another camper on the way to the bathroom, and wandering off the path in the darkness. As I continued to listen, though slow, steady noise suggested otherwise. It almost sounded like whoever, or whatever, was out there was circling the tent. I say whatever because it didn't fully sound like footsteps. Instead, it almost sounded like something sliding, scraping along the forest floor. I felt a chill run down my spine. I looked over to Stan. He was still fast asleep. I swallowed. The last thing I wanted to do was wake him up, especially if it turned out to be something as silly as a deer. Trying to steady my racing breath, I decided to instead turn my attention back to the noise outside. I attempted to reason with myself as I strained to listen. We were in a well-populated, official campground. Surely whatever was out there couldn't be that dangerous. Animals came into the campgrounds. I knew that, but it seemed like the odds of being attacked by some wild animal less than 50 feet from a ranger station had to be close to zero. Whatever was out there continued to circle the tent. I was sure that was what it was doing. Now, I heard Penelope begin to whine. She'd evidently been awoken as well. I looked over at her, trying to make out her small shape in the darkness. I wanted to call her over to me, away from the entrance of the tent. I knew that if whatever was out there was dangerous, a few extra feet between her, and it wouldn't do much good. I didn't dare call out anyways, too scared of alerting whatever was out there to our presence. As I continued to listen, I heard the strange sliding noise stop. It sounded like it was right behind the tent, right above Stan, and I almost screamed as a low hiss reached my ears. That was enough for Penelope, evidently, as she collapsed into a fit of panicked barks. It seemed like a spell had been broken with her first bark. Stan shot up and immediately demanded to know what was going on. As Penelope tried to claw her way out of the tent, there was a loud crash outside, then silence. What the hell is going on? Stan demanded, anger overriding any remaining sleepiness. I tried to recount what had just happened to him. The scraping noise, the circling, the hiss. I was barely halfway through explaining when he rolled his eyes. It was probably just a deer, he said. A deer, it hissed, I said, forgetting myself in fear of whatever had been out there. Deer make weird noises. God, I get the dog freaking out, but you, Stan asked. I'm not freaking out, I said. There was something out there. Michael said Marie heard something too. Marie probably also heard a deer. Jesus Christ, I didn't know I was going on a camping trip with a 12-year-old. Stan said. I felt tears pricking my eyes. Things had just been going so well. Finally, I'm sorry, I murmured. I just got freaked out. You're right. It was silly. We woke up later than planned the next day. Unsurprising, after last night's events, I thought. My previous panic slowly came back to me. In the daylight, I could see Stan's side more easily. It was rather silly of me to be panicking over what was probably just a curious deer. It had sounded like it was sliding, or slithering, or whatever, sure, but how much did I really know about wildlife? I pushed the thoughts out of my mind, deciding instead to focus on the day ahead of us. Stan and I headed out for the second hike he had chosen, a longer one, nearly 12 miles, round trip. I glanced at the time when he said that, trying to keep the frown off my face. It seemed like it was a little late to start such a long hike. Stan was quick to assure me it would be fine, though. We stopped at the ranger station near the campground to use the bathrooms and fill up our water bottles before we set off. The ranger we'd met a few days before was there again and once again greeted us with a friendly smile. Penelope had apparently picked this particular night to be shy, so I ended up holding her leash off to the side while Stan chatted with the ranger and bought firewood. What type of dog is that, by the way? The ranger asked. As Stan turned to leave, I saw his face light up instantly. Penelope was a rare breed, one he'd spent several $1,000s and a trip to another country on to acquire. He loved getting to tell people that. A Kronforlander, Stan replied. They're a sort of rare German breed. There's not many in America. She's very cute, the ranger said. I could tell Stan wanted to continue the conversation, but another man had walked up, grabbing the ranger's attention. We had to head out of the park to a nearby town to drop Penelope off at a kennel Stan had booked for the day, since dogs weren't allowed on most trails. Stan ranted about the stupidity of that rule as we drove back to the trail. The hike was gorgeous. Stan had mentioned that it trailed along the lake for a bit before veering upwards to the ridge, but it seemed a bit was far longer than I'd thought. Not that I had any complaints. The said lake was a stunning sapphire blue. It was hard to really focus on the beautiful scenery with the position of the sun nagging at me. However, it seemed to be moving far faster than usual. It was probably my imagination. I felt a distinct chill of anxiety creep down my spine at the thought of being out here at night. Round 1, about 2 hours into our trek, we sat down to have lunch. We had only been stopped for a few minutes when a man emerged from the brush. Not trail, he literally pushed his way through the thick bushes up ahead. I jumped at the sudden intrusion, a gasp escaping my lips. The man stared at us for a moment. His face was unreadable. Then, he straightened up. Afternoon, he said. There was something off about his voice. It was raspy, as though he didn't use it much, or chain smoked on the daily, or both. Afternoon, Stan returned, narrowing his eyes. You two headed past the lake, the man asked. That was the only place this trail went, so that seemed obvious. Of course, he had just come from off trail, so maybe it wasn't to him. We are, Stan said, dismissively. I could tell he didn't want to keep interacting with this man any more than I did. Pretty day out for a hike, the man said. I'd keep an eye on the sun though. He stared at us. We stared back, unsure what else to say. I looked over at Stan. He was still looking at the newcomer. Well, I'll let you two get on with your lunch, the man said. Then he walked past us, heading back down the mountain without another word. Once he was out of sight, I broke the silence. What the hell was that? I asked, my voice a whisper. Stan shrugged. I dunno. Crazy mountain man. Lost crackhead. He's gone now anyways. I frowned, my gaze trailing back to where the man had disappeared around the bend of the trail. Seriously, that didn't creep you out? I asked. I mean, he was weird, but you're bound to run into weird people sometimes, Stan said with another shrug. My mind wasn't fully put at ease, but I nodded. He was right, I told myself, looking back at my sandwich. Once we finished lunch, we continued hiking. I couldn't help but notice how few people were on the trail. That day, that, combined with the strange man from earlier, and of course, the ever-present knowledge we were in grizzly country, kept my anxiety constantly at the edge of boiling over. God, we just had to pick the one hike that no one is on, I thought as we rounded a series of large boulders. By now, the shadows were beginning to grow long. We still hadn't reached the ridge. We hadn't even cleared the lake. I felt like we must have been well past the 6 miles it took to reach the ridge. At this point, I debated whether or not to say something. I decided against it. Stan would just tell me he knew what he was doing, that he was the hiking expert with several years of experience on me, and all of that. So we continued on. When the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, though, and we were still nowhere near any sort of ridge, I finally stopped. Maybe we should start heading back, I suggested, gesturing toward the sun. Stan turned to face me. His face was red and shiny with sweat, both emphasized by the orange glow of the sun. It should be right up here, Stan said. Well, do you have the map? I could take a look at it, I offered. Stan rolled his eyes. I know how to read a map, Michelle, he said. He set his bag down, presumably to pull the map out. After a few moments of rustling around, he looked up at me. Did you take the map? He asked, an icy edge to his voice. No, I haven't touched it, I said quickly. It's not there. Why the fuck would I be asking you if you took it if it was here? God, Michelle, you can really be dumb sometimes. Stan gave the backpack a kick in frustration. Sorry, I said, swallowing. I took a steadying breath. Maybe it fell out. It was right here, Stan said, shaking his head. I know I packed it. I know, I saw you pack it. Did you take it out during lunch? Maybe we can check Google Maps, I suggested. I pulled my phone out, only to be greeted with no reception and a dying battery. So much for that idea. I took another breath, trying to stay calm. We weren't lost, at least, I reasoned. We were still on the trail, even if it wasn't the trail that led to the ridge. We could still backtrack. I told Stan as much. The dying sunset was growing even more golden, adding urgency to my words. If we hurried, we might be able to get at least partway off the mountain before dark, maybe to a more populated area. Whatever trail this was. Alright, Stan agreed. Come on, let's get going. Our descent was tense, to say the least. I could practically feel the anger coming off of Stan, and I didn't dare say anything for fear of making it worse. Despite our best efforts, we weren't even back at our lunch spot when dusk began to turn to dark, and it became nearly impossible to see. I pulled my phone out. Its flashlight barely cut a few feet ahead through the darkness, but it was better than nothing. Stan did the same. I frowned, wishing I'd checked with him that he'd brought a flashlight. I'd assumed that was a given, with all of his hiking experience. Oh well, I could hardly judge someone for forgetting something. Our progress was massively hindered by the dim lighting that, along with the rocky trail, made every step feel like a potential fall. Potential turned into actual when I misjudged a loose rock. It gave way beneath my boot. I yelped as I fell to the ground, the cold stones cutting into my flesh. My phone hit the ground, the light disappearing. I saw the remaining light spin around. Jesus Christ, I told you to watch your step, Stan said. I winced. Sorry, I said. I just don't want you to get hurt, Stan replied. Are you alright? He crouched down in front of me, the light shining in my face. I gave a soft nod. I think so, I said. I raised my hands to examine the damage. A couple of scrapes, but nothing worse. That was a relief. It definitely hurt worse than that. I looked back to the ground, scanning for my phone. Thankfully, it had only fallen face down. It seemed to still be working fine otherwise. Stan helped me to my feet, and we continued on. We hadn't taken more than 3 steps each when we heard it. A sharp crack in the woods to our right. Both of our heads snapped toward the source of the sound at the same time. I felt my blood run cold. Please don't be a bear. Please don't be a bear. I prayed silently. It's probably just a deer, Stan said. I heard a rare hint of doubt in his usually confident voice. If I get out of this alive, I am never going hiking again, I thought. There was another crack, this time from further up the trail. We should keep moving, I said, swallowing. I tried to remember what you were supposed to do if you encountered a predator. Not be wandering around the woods after dark was probably high up on that list. My mind offered. Look big, don't run, make noise. I forced myself to keep my pace steady. As I started to walk again, thinking about the other two, I wasn't sure how I was supposed to do either of those. I was 5'3" on a good day. Stan cut a pretty imposing figure, at least. Did make noise mean like sing, yell, bang rocks together. I didn't have time to keep fretting over the vaguely recalled instructions because something crashed through the bushes in front of us. It was, well, I wasn't sure what it was. It was definitely big enough to take up the entire trail. It didn't look like a bear, but in the dim lighting, I couldn't see much more detail. From what I could make out, it almost looked like a fallen log, except it was definitely moving. Run, run, Stan shouted. I stared, frozen in shock for a moment, as Stan darted off into the woods. He didn't wait for me to respond after yelling to run, before he took off into the thick trees. I wondered if he had gotten a better look at whatever that thing in front of us was, if that was what had caused him to dash off so quickly. I didn't have much time to think about it as my senses came back to me, and I raced after him. Any concern over what we should be doing had flown from my mind along with any fears of falling. All I was focused on was catching up with Stan and figuring out what the hell had just happened. My tender ankle, combined with a shorter stride, meant that I couldn't run nearly as fast as Stan though. Within a few moments, I found myself alone in the dark trees. I forced myself to continue onward, realizing I was screaming Stan's name at some point. It hit me all at once how incredibly stupid this was. We'd just run from the trail, the one source of some protection and safety we had. We didn't have a map. We didn't have actual flashlights. We didn't even have jackets. And now, of course, there wasn't even a we, I realized, slowing to a stop and gasping for breath. Stan, I shouted between gasps, my hands on my knees. The silence of the forest answered me. Had it always been this quiet? I wondered. I could have sworn the woods were alive with crickets and other nocturnal creatures earlier. Now, the darkness surrounding me felt almost alive, like it was some sentient force muffling any sound that tried to reach my ears. Taking another breath, I straightened up, shining my flashlight around for any sign of Stan. There wasn't any. He probably hadn't even realized I'd fallen behind. I was at a loss for what to do next. I realized I was no longer sure which direction we'd come from. The trees looked the same no matter where I looked. Damn, I whispered. I looked around again, hoping for something that would help. I wasn't even sure what. And then I heard the scream. It sliced through the silence like a knife. I knew who it belonged to immediately. Stan, Stan, I shrieked, taking off in the direction it seemed like the scream had come from. A second scream sounded. It was filled with terror. I didn't think I'd ever heard Stan sound afraid like that. Stan, where are you? I shouted. Stay back. His cry was cut off, instead turning into a strangled, choking sound. I had to be close. I swung my light around, trying to catch any sign of movement or color in the darkness. A flash of beige caught my attention. It didn't seem to match the surrounding trees. It had a scaly, almost shiny appearance, and then it was gone. I ran in the direction of it anyways, only to find a space between two trees where it had been. Everything after that was a blur. They say trauma does that, makes you forget details. Sometimes, whole events. I wasn't sure how long I stumbled around out there, still shouting for Stan. From time to time, I would hear something rustling in the bushes, Every time my blood would run cold, I'd change direction, trying to silently move away from the noise, and hoping against all hope that whatever was out there didn't find me. It started to rain at some point. It plastered my hair to my face and soaked the thin long-sleeved t-shirt I was wearing. After what felt like both hours and mere minutes, I saw a light appear in the trees in front of me. Then the voices reached my ears, faint at first, and then loud enough to make out the words. "Well, I hope you're feeling better." "I'm fine. I think I just ate something that didn't agree with me." A few moments later, I stumbled out of the trees, practically into the gravel parking lot. There were two people standing in the parking lot, in the headlights of a truck with a Park Service logo. I shielded my eyes. I heard surprised, then relieved murmurs as they noticed me. After that, I remember someone catching me as I collapsed, repeating that there was something out there. I'm fairly sure I wasn't making much sense at that point. One of the rangers, the blonde one we'd met before, ironically enough, hurriedly gave me a blanket, ushering me into the warmth of the truck while the other radioed the situation in. Apparently, they'd gotten a report of an abandoned car in the parking lot and had come out to investigate. I'd learn later I'd gotten lucky and stumbled out of the tree line just before they left. Sitting in the warm truck, feeling began to return to both my body and mind. "Stan is still out there," I said, my voice weak from a mixture of exhaustion and fear. "You have to go find him." "This Stan was hiking with you?" the other ranger asked. I nodded. "We got separated. I heard him screaming. I think there's something out there. It got him." I collapsed into sobs at that point. "All right, it's going to be all right. You're safe now," the darker-haired ranger said. "I'm Ranger Tom Thornton. This is Ranger Alex Lindorm. What was your name?" "Michelle," I said, trying to take a steadying breath. "Michelle Harrington. And you were hiking with someone named Stan?" Tom asked. "My boyfriend," I said. "Stanley Daniels." We headed out late, and it got dark so fast, and I should have told him we needed to go back, and then there was something out there. Alex gave me a sympathetic smile, nodding as if to encourage me to keep going. "We heard it first, and then this thing landed in front of the trail. I don't know, it was too dark to see what it was, and Stan started running, and I tried to follow him, but he was just gone, until I heard him screaming. Oh God, the screams. They were awful. You guys have to go find him. You have to find whatever that thing was. It was following me. Oh my God." I collapsed into sobs. The rangers exchanged glances, and I realized how insane I must sound, rambling about a vague something in the forest that had stalked me and attacked my boyfriend. To their credit, neither of them outwardly expressed their doubt of my story. When I finished speaking, Tom nodded. "Okay, we're going to get a search party together for your boyfriend. How about you come back to the station with us? EMTs can check you out, and we can figure out what we're going to do next," Tom said. I gave a small nod through the tears that were still flowing. I just wanted to be away from that forest as soon as I could be. The drive back to the ranger station felt surreal, the trees spilling past the car window in a haze. I winced as my arm bumped into the truck's door while climbing out upon arriving. "You okay?" Alex asked. I nodded quickly. "Did you hurt your arm out there?" "No, it's from something else," I said quietly. I shifted, pulling my sleeve further over the dark bruise on my upper arm. "Okay," he said, for a moment looking like he wanted to question me further on that. I prayed he wouldn't. For the first time that day, it seemed like my prayers were answered. We headed inside, and by the time I was done answering a further barrage of questions and being checked out by the EMTs, the sun was beginning to peek over the horizon. The rangers had coordinated a search party in surprisingly little time. By the time the sun was fully up, they had already headed out there. A ranger named Crystal Everts was kind enough to keep me company for most of the sleepless morning that ensued. I found myself endlessly grateful for that company. I had never really thought about the after in these sort of situations before. It seemed like stories always ended with being rescued, the aftermath left to the footnotes. Now that I was experiencing it, I was glad it at least included a mug of coffee, even if it was instant coffee. "Do you think they'll find him?" I asked between sips. Crystal gave me a soft smile, but I saw doubt flickering in her eyes. "They'll do everything they can. We have some of the best search and rescue rangers in the country," she said. I was silent for a moment. When I spoke again, it took me a moment to even realize I was doing so. "It got him. What you thought you saw out there, Crystal asked. I didn't think I saw it. I mean, I don't even know what I saw, but I know there was something out there, I said. I sound crazy, don't I? I said after a minute. Crystal shook her head. You sound like you went through something very difficult. Sometimes, in those situations, our mind can play tricks on us, she said. That just seems like a polite way of saying I sound crazy, I said. I glanced past her to a photo on her desk. It contained a group of smiling people. I recognized 3 of them. The other 3 were unfamiliar. A tall man with a cowboy hat, a blonde woman wearing a bright orange tank top, and a redhead with a Medusa design snaking around her upper arm. Those are the 2 rangers who found me. Are you friends? I attempted to change the subject, nodding to the figures I recognized in the photo. Thankfully, it seemed to work. Crystal glanced back at it. Alex and Tom. Yeah, they're good guys, she said. Who are the others? Truthfully, I didn't really care who the other people in the photo were, but talking about something random felt preferable to thinking about the present. Crystal seemed to pick up on that. Well, the blonde woman, that's Lauren. She's a tour guide. The bearded guy, he's a ranger too. His name's John. And the redhead, she worked here as a biologist before she could finish. A man I didn't recognize appeared in the doorway. We found something, he said. Stan, I asked. He shook his head. A phone. In the area. You were found. We think it might be his. Do you think you'd be able to confirm? Yeah, I can do that, I said. He glanced over at Crystal. There was something unreadable in his eyes. In that moment, I knew that cell phone was going to be the only thing they found of Stan. After I confirmed that it was indeed his, Alex, and Crystal took me back over to my campsite. I had called my parents. I hadn't spoken to them in ages, so I can only imagine how it felt to receive a call like this out of the blue. Despite that, they were relieved, both to hear from me and to hear that I was okay. They'd insisted on flying out the next day to bring me back to our home. Home. That was a word that hadn't had a meaning to me for a while. Stan and his apartment had never really felt like a home if I was being honest. They weren't the only ones feeling relieved, though guilt coursed through me as soon as I realized this. Stan was most likely dead, and I was feeling relieved. How messed up of a person are you? God, he was right. I am a psycho. I thought bitterly as we drove back to the campground. The 2 rangers had volunteered, on their day off, at that, to help me pack up the camp and drive me to a nearby hotel that my parents had booked. They insisted it was nothing, but as I stepped out of the truck and looked at the empty tent, that nothing felt like it meant the world. It didn't take long to pack things up, not with 3 people and 2 with enough experience for at least a dozen. I wondered what I was supposed to do with Stan's things. Crystal left towards the end to use the restroom. Are you okay? Alex asked quietly as she walked away. Yeah, I'll be fine. Stan is the one. No, are you okay? Alex glanced towards my shoulder, the one with the bruise. Fuck, it wasn't what you think, I said, looking down and pulling my cardigan tighter around myself. I don't want to put you on the spot, but someone close to me was in a not-so-great relationship once, and they used to say the same thing. So, if it was what you think I just wanted to say you're not alone, and things get better. I felt tears pricking my eyes, the little composure I had left breaking down. Thanks, I said quietly. Once Crystal returned, we finished loading my bag into the truck and headed to the hotel. It was a weird feeling leaving the park in such a different way than I had entered. When we got to the hotel, I checked in, and Crystal and Alex were nice enough to help me unload my things. Once I had brought the last bag in, I took a deep breath. There were countless things to do tomorrow. Talk to the police about Stan's disappearance. Figure out what I was supposed to do with Penelope. I figured I had always wanted a dog of my own. Meet my parents. Say thank you to the old man that had mentioned he'd seen 2 people headed up on the trail late. It had turned out the guy I thought was a creep had been the reason the rangers were at the parking lot when I finally found my way from the tree line. Despite that, I guessed I would have trouble sleeping that night. My mind was alive with racing thoughts, pieces and snippets of the past 24 hours slowly forming into some sort of picture. It wasn't until Crystal and Alex were headed out that I was handed, literally, the piece of that picture that made it come together. Thank you both. I really appreciate it, I said, standing at the door of the hotel room. Of course, we're sorry about your boyfriend. We still haven't given up hope of finding him, Crystal said. I didn't correct her to say that I had. I wasn't sure how I felt so certain, but I knew whatever was out there had made sure he wouldn't be coming back. "We'll do everything we can," Alex said. He paused. "Oh, I almost forgot. I picked this up at the campsite earlier. Thought it might be yours." He pulled a map from his jacket pocket, handing it to me. I froze upon seeing it. It wasn't just any map. It was the map, the one Stan had sworn he'd put in his backpack. The one I'd seen him put in his backpack. The one we'd been unable to find that evening. "You found this at the campsite?" I asked, slowly taking the map from him. He nodded. "Where exactly?" He gave me a quizzical look, as if he wasn't sure why it mattered. "In the tent, by Stan's stuff." I had packed up Stan's stuff, and not only was I sure the map was in his backpack, when we left for the hike, I was sure I would have seen it with his stuff. That wasn't possible, but what it implied seemed even less possible. I hesitated. I thought back to Stan, and his first in-person date. It had been during the height of the pandemic, so it was hard to meet up at first. When we finally did, we went to the zoo. He was so charming, so kind that day. I wished he had stayed that way. I thought of the countless arguments, the way I watched myself turn into someone I didn't recognize, the way he had hurt me, the nights I had spent crying. I took a deep breath. "You know, I think you were right. What you said about trauma making people see things," I said to Crystal. "I'm not sure what happened after Stan and I were separated. I'm not sure I actually even heard him yelling." I looked over at Alex. "I hope your friend is doing better, by the way. She is now, and I think you will be, eventually, too." I gave a small nod. "Maybe. Well, thank you again for everything," I said after a moment. "Have a good night," he said. I closed the door, feeling like I was also opening one to another chance at life, to healing, to freedom. I wouldn't have thought it started with an empty hotel room, but I guess life always has a way of twisting around itself, like a winding serpent. It's been years since Stan went missing now. As I guessed, he was never found, and eventually the search died down, relegating his disappearance to an occasional footnote in stories about tragic things that happened in the park. Penelope is sitting on my lap as I write this. We both have an apartment in my home city now. I haven't been back to the park, not out of fear, though. It just feels like a chapter that's closed. You know, maybe snakes aren't so bad. I work for a commercial cleaning company who specializes in cleaning run-down, abandoned buildings and getting them ready for refurbishment. We were hired to clean out an old hospital that had been abandoned for some 20-odd years. My team, of which there were 3 of us, was assigned to the behavioral health unit, or more simply, the psych ward. While I was clearing out rooms of dusty, old linens and mattress pads, I found an old marble journal tucked under one of the pads. I opened it up and flipped through quickly and saw that it was about half filled with journal entries. I thought it was pretty cool, so I slid it into my back pocket so I could read it later and went back to work. I totally forgot about it until I got into the car to drive home. When I got home, I decided to read it, and what I found inside was terrifying, mostly because of the similarities between what was in the journal and what we had cleaned up earlier today. I'll go over the connections I found between the journal and what I saw today later. But before that, let me share the story. I'm going to try and stay as true to the writing in the journal as possible, so that means some things might be misspelled, and some grammar might not be perfect. If it's underlined on the page, I'll underline it here, written in all caps. I'll type it in all caps. So let's get started. Day 1, 12 p.m. The ER nurse lied to me. She said I could leave after 3 days. The doctor here said she decides when I leave. She said I won't be out in 3 days. I don't want to be here. I don't belong here. Day 2, 11 a.m. I've been here 24 hours. I don't want to be here. I don't belong here. They do a patient check every 15 minutes. If you're in your room, they knock loudly on the door. They don't care about the time. I can't sleep. They gave me my meds and say they have mood stabilizers for me tonight. I miss Thea. I miss my bed. This is my world now. Day 3, 11 a.m. It's been 42 hours. I'm feeling a little better. I broke down last night. I played some Monopoly earlier today. It was fun. After I broke down, I was given meds to calm me down. I laughed for the first time since coming here. Day 5. I'm okay. I'll be okay. Day 7. It's time to go home. They won't let me leave. I don't know why. I ask and they ignore me. I just want to go home. Day 10. There was a huge boom from outside. None of the nurses reacted. They just carried on like normal. All I can see out the window is black smoke. Day 14. We found a nurse in the hallway this morning. He was dead. We've been seeing less and less each day, but since we found him, we haven't seen anyone else. Day 27. There hasn't been a single nurse or doctor or security or anyone at all since we found the nurse in the hallway. The door knocking hasn't stopped though. Every 15 minutes, if a room door is closed, it will knock. Food still shows up. Meds still show up in the medicine window. Day 28. Gerald tried to jump through the window at the nurse station. Something we couldn't see stopped him and dragged him back out. He was dragged all the way to the quiet room. We hesitantly followed and watched as he was hauled up onto the slab bed. They watched the straps wrap themselves around him and tie him down. Then the room door slammed shut. That was this morning. It's almost lights out. I can still hear him screaming. Poor guy. I guess security is still here. Day 32. It's been over a month. We put the body of the nurse in Gerald's room since he doesn't need it anymore. Gerald is still strapped down in the quiet room, still screaming. I don't know how. Out the window is just smoke. Large, roiling, jet black columns of smoke, painting the sky a large swath of uncolor. We're still fed. Don't know where it comes from, but it always shows up at the end of the hallway and wheels itself down to us. Day reducted. It's been a while. A lot has happened. A lot of the lights have stopped working. The knocking never does. Some of the windows have cracks in them. Don't know how. None of us could even scratch them. There is no more outside. It's just black. The smoke took over the sky weeks ago. I'm really not sure about the time. Haven't seen natural light since. They only know days because the lights, what few we have left, dim for a bit every few hours or so. The water stopped getting hot a few days ago. With the lights, the windows, and now the water, it's almost like this place is dying. Gerald stopped screaming eventually, still strapped down. We can still see him moving from time to time, so we know he's still alive. Don't know how he survives, but I do know that none of us want to piss off whatever thing he did. Day, I don't know. We have to get out of here. Doris went into her room, and the door closed behind her. It wouldn't open. Something unseen dragged her to the bed and held her there. We watched as the bed then made itself with her in it. That wouldn't have been that bad, except that when it was done, Doris was just a red smear between the sheets and the bed. There's not even a bulge where her body is. She's just gone. The door has stayed closed ever since. No one is brave enough to go into their rooms now. We're all just staying in the day room now. Been a few days. I lost this book for a bit. It's not that strange. Stuff sometimes goes missing here. We just assume the housekeepers got it. The strange part is that I found it in Gerald's room, next to the body of the nurse. Now just a semi-wet pile of meat and bones. No idea why that room won't clean itself. We've lost a couple other folks to housekeeping. That's what we call what happened to Doris. Maybe we'll try and look in Gerald's room for more stuff we lost. Day after last entry. It was a bad idea. The nurse wasn't dead. I don't know how it couldn't be. It was literally just a pile of meat and bones. And yet, we were in Gerald's room looking for lost stuff. Ron bumped into the nurse's body, and it jumped at him. It dug its bone fingers into his neck, a wet squelching noise accompanying its every movement. Ron's strangled, gurgled scream quickly stopped. I'm ashamed to say we ran. We left him there, with the nurse thing still digging away at his neck. We closed and barricaded the door. I don't know anymore. It's been a few days. I can still hear the nurse thing moving around in Gerald's room. Every now and then we hear a wet slap against the door. The flies are terrible. Clark got taken by housekeeping. A window broke out of nowhere. It just shattered. Some smoke came in, just a little. Like a creeping miasma, it slithered its way across the ceiling and just sat there. We used a table to block the window and keep any more smoke from getting in. Now we're just watching it. Who cares? We need to leave. Jenny decided to touch the smoke. It grabbed her. Like a snake, a thin trail came out and coiled itself around her outstretched arm and down her body and dragged her into itself. It's unthinkable how such little smoke consumed someone whole. I say consumed because that's what it did. It ate her, not all at once and not quickly. We tried to save her, tried to drag her back down to us. Even with all of us pulling, we couldn't get her to budge. I think I heard something of hers pop or break or dislocate when we were pulling, but we couldn't save her, so we had to watch. We had to watch as it slowly pulled her into itself. There was no noise, except for Jenny's screeches and screams, but it did eat her. Eventually, I don't think I'll ever forget her screams. We stay away from it now. It stays on the ceiling, moving around, but never comes down. We're now living in fear of yet another unexplainable thing. Too long. The nurse, no idea. Was he ever dead? Was he even human? Gerald, not dead somehow, still strapped down. Doris, housekeeping. Aspen, housekeeping. Donald, housekeeping. Vaughn, the nurse thing. Jenny, eaten by the smoke. Danielle, eaten by the smoke. We're leaving. We've lost too many people just sitting here trying to survive. We'll unblock the window and hop out. There's a small landing with an access hatch about half a story below. I'm leaving this book here as a way to ensure we are not forgotten. If you find this, I didn't live to come back for it. Goodbye. Note, this journal was found in the room of a mental patient who jumped out of his window to his death. I came back. I didn't write that. I don't know who did it, but it wasn't me. I found this journal right where I left it. It's just me now. We didn't even make it out of the hospital. I came back because I'd rather die here, where I'm at least taken care of. We were exploring the hospital for about a week. I would say this place hasn't changed much. The black smoke is still there. It moves around the ceiling, following me. I feel like it's watching me, like a predator watching its prey, not actively hunting, but just waiting for any little slip up so it can bag itself an easy meal. It won't be from me. I guess I should explain what happened and how everyone died. When we left, there were still 6 of us. May, Jewel, Richard, Alberto, Gwen, Ray. I don't know what we expected to find when we left, but there was no way for us to guess what we saw. Narrator note, the entire next page is fully scribbled out. I'll put a link to it in the comments. Just woke up from a nap. Something more is going on. I took a nap after writing the last page. When I woke up, I saw it was completely scribbled out. I didn't do that. I guess something didn't like what I had to say. I can't remember what I wrote. Honestly, I can't really remember most of yesterday. This place hurts to be in, hurts to think about. It just hurts. Good news though, the food still shows up. It's been 2 days. I guess I'll try again to write down what happened. When I left, outside the window was a small drop down to an access hatch. We quickly filed out and fell down. I couldn't help but notice no more smoke made its way through the window. Even now, sitting here writing this, I don't have the window blocked. It doesn't make much of a difference, if I'm honest. There is no weather, no wind, everything is still. I don't hear any animals or bugs, no cars, no people, nothing, just silence. The world is empty. Back to what happened. We hopped down to the access hatch. We managed to open it and dropped down into the floor below. I'd tell you a floor number, but I honestly don't know. When we hopped down, we were in a hallway, long and semi-lit. I guess the rest of the hospital was falling apart, just like our unit. Half of the lights were either flickering dimly or just out. Still enough light to see where we were going though. The hallway had elevators on one side and a few rooms on the other. The rooms were labeled Radiology 1, 2, 3, and so on. Throughout the entire hall was a low humming and beeping, the sound of medical equipment left on. Being all too familiar with house cleaning, we didn't dare go into any of the rooms. One wanted to take the elevator, but the rest of us said no. There's no telling what horror that would have led to. Once we got our bearings, we chose a direction and started walking. It was dark. We could barely see the floor. I guess that's why we didn't notice at first. When we did notice, we were too terrified to move. We had been walking maybe 10 minutes. The hallway just went on and on. Every now and then we would pass a sign with an arrow and the word visitation on it pointing the way we were going. Occasionally we would come to large intersections with multiple hallways leading off. It was in one of these intersections we noticed what was around us. All over the walls were dark stains, the color of dried blood. Everywhere on the floor we found wet piles of rotting meat and bone, like our nurse thing. It's amazing how we didn't smell it at first, but once we noticed, it was all we could smell. It was horrible. Just thinking about it makes me want to puke. Even now, I had to go throw up. I caught a whiff of the smell. I don't want to think about where it came from. Richard and Jewel, we were stood in the intersection, surrounded by potential monsters. We had no idea how long these things could last like they were. Hell, they were literally half rotted. Once we found our nerves, we decided to move on. It's honestly a miracle we hadn't bumped into a pile. Before then, our luck couldn't last forever though. In the dark confines of a particularly tight hallway, Richard lost his balance and ended up stepping on a meat pile. It instantly rose up and swallowed him, more an amorphous blob of meat and bone than anything resembling the human form. His scream was quick but loud, loud enough to wake the dead. Unfortunately, I don't say that as an expression. Apparently noise also sets them off. 2 more of the meat blobs suddenly launched themselves at the closest person. Jewel was gone in an instant, the blobs fully enclosing her before she could even scream. Richard was a bit slower. We watched as whatever bones the blob had forced their way into and through him, a long bone through his neck, what looked like maybe fingers digging into his gut, a couple ribs into his thigh, on and on. They watched in horror for what felt like hours, too scared to move. When he finally stopped moving, we managed to collect our senses and run. When, a few days later, we had moved a few floors down via the staircase, we were never able to take just one the entire way. There was always a blockage forcing us out into the hospital proper, through more halls and rooms we weren't sure we would make it out of. Gwen was leading us through a hall. She took a turn and all we heard was the faintest squeak, and then nothing. We waited around the corner for a while, before carefully peeking our heads out. About a foot from where the wall turns was a massive wall of the black smoke, floor to ceiling, wall to wall. There was no way through. Gwen must have walked right into it, gone before she even realized it. Poor girl, Ray. Ray had the worst fate of anyone, except maybe Gerald. Ray was leading the remains of our group, just Alberto, myself, and Ray, through the kitchen. This was about a day after Gwen. As we were walking through the kitchen, past stoves, and burners, and rotten food, Ray saw something on the counter, I still don't know what, and reached for it. His hand was cut in half, all 4 fingers gone at the knuckles. Next, the skin on his arm was peeled off, like skin on a fish. He watched his arm get sliced into small sections, unable to move. Alberto and I tried pulling him away, but we couldn't. After his arm, Ray was haphazardly thrown onto the counter, and the rest of his body was cut up, prepared like meat at a butcher shop. I saw a few pieces get flung into a pot on the stove before Alberto, and I ran away while the cooks went to work on the rest of Ray. I skipped my meals the next few days after I got back, just in case. Alberto was just unlucky. After what happened to Ray, we decided to just go back to our unit. It was all too much. Alberto and I quickly backtracked. A few days later, we found a stairwell that said to be HU psych. We were almost back. Running up the stairs, Alberto didn't notice a blob on the next step up, stepped right on it. Of course it launched itself at him. It ended up tackling Alberto over the railing and down into the empty central column of the stairwell. They fell, Alberto and the blob. They fell what must have been 10 stories. Of course we couldn't have been that high up. I watched them tumble down, the blob ripping chunks out of Alberto. Then I noticed what was at the bottom, a roiling, bubbling, almost boiling pool of the black smoke, all the way down. Alberto and the blob were plummeting towards it. Alberto fell in quietly, the meat blob fell in, and everything was the opposite of silence. How I got back, I guess these things don't like each other. When the meat blob fell into the black smoke, at first there was a blinding light. I can't describe the color, it was beyond white. That's all that comes into my mind when I try to recall what it looked like. Beyond white is the best I can do. With the light came the noise, deafening, the sound of flies, buzzing so loud I couldn't hear myself scream. I was lucky to open my eyes quickly enough to see the black smoke rocketing up towards me. I quickly threw myself back against the wall as the black smoke shot up past me and continued on upwards, filling the central column. I admit it took me longer than I'm proud of to regain control of myself. The light, the noise, the powerful wind from the rush of the smoke. It was almost too much. I felt the smoke glaring at me. I was angry. I wanted to eat, but it was hurt. If I was more of an action hero, I would maybe do something with that information. But I'm not, so I ran. I ran up the stairs as fast as I could. I ran through the door marking floor 3. I ran through the halls, following the signs for the behavioral health unit, thanking whatever power above that all these doors were unlocked. I crashed through the twin doors leading back to where this all started. I collapsed onto the floor, finally feeling some semblance of safety. I don't know how long I was out for. I only realized after I woke up, all the doors that were unlocked, they all locked behind me as I ran. Now I'm stuck here again. It's been a few days. I'm alone. Gerald is still here, of course. He's still strapped down. He's little more than literal skin and bones now, but he's still moving. The water is still cold. The window is still broken. The smoke still follows me. The food still rolls down the hall towards me. I did learn something through all this though. The realization of false hope is more damaging than no hope at all. So for now, I'll just live here with no hope of getting out. I'll be okay. That's the whole thing. Pretty creepy if you ask me. When I was cleaning up earlier today, I noticed the ceiling was smudged with a lot of black stuff. Windows were cracked, with one window leading to an access hatch broken open. In the solitary hold rooms, I guess what the writer called the quiet rooms, there was one bed with its straps tied down. Nothing on the bed though. A few of the rooms had linens that were completely stained with something. Honestly, couldn't tell you what. Walking through the hospital, I also noticed a lot of stains on the floors. I can't say for certain, but I've had to clean up dead bodies before, and the stains in the hospital looked exactly like the kind of stain a body leaves when it sits and rots for a long time. After reading that and comparing what happened in the journal with the kind of mess I found, I'm honestly considering calling out tomorrow. Maybe even just call out for however long it takes to finish cleaning that hospital. The checkout line of the local grocery store in the hometown I left behind. I tried to keep my eyes forward and avoid eye contact as I paid for my frozen dinner and hoped to get out of Dodge before I had to talk to someone I knew but hadn't talked to in 15 years. James, I heard a woman's voice chime from behind me. I couldn't help but utter the word damn, drawing a grin from the high school age checkout girl. I put the smallest smile humanly possible on my face and looked over my shoulder to see a woman with a poof of gray hair standing at my hip with an armful of groceries sloppily spread across the chest of the dirty Garfield Christmas sweatshirt she wore in September. I don't think I had actually seen the woman since I was 9 years old, but I instantly recognized her as Barbara, the woman who ran the daycare I went to when I was very young. I stuck my credit card in the machine and started the process of paying for my groceries. Before I spoke, Barbara's cracked lips spread into a wide smile across her wrinkled face. Yeah, I can't believe you've grown into. When I watched you, you were this tall, Barbara said, and then held her hand flat at about the level of my waist. Yeah, people grow, it's true. I agreed in a manner I hope wasn't as snarky as it seems writing it out now. I let out a nervous chuckle and started to backpedal away from the checkout line. Are you staying at your folks' place right now? Barbara asked. Yeah, I ran into your sister about 6 months ago. I'm so sorry to hear about your mom, Barbara went on. Barbara ignored the cashier and stuck me with a hug before I could slip any further. I felt her bosom awkwardly smash up against my rib cage. Thank you, I muttered. Barbara thankfully pulled away from me. I told your sister I remembered 2 things about you. You walked on your toes for some reason, and you and your sister constantly talked about monsters a lot. You two were always really scared of bloody monsters. I couldn't get the second thing Barbara said out of my head. As I drove up the highway towards the house I grew up in and both my parents had died in within the past couple of years, I called up my sister. She didn't answer. She hadn't answered her phone in months. I don't know why I even kept trying. I left a voicemail. It's Sam. I just ran into Barbara, the lady who ran our daycare, at the store, and she said something weird. She specifically mentioned we always talked about monsters and being scared of bloody monsters. Weird she specifically mentioned that, but I wanted to talk to you about it, see what you might have remembered. I kind of remember being scared a lot, but would never have thought it would be something enough for her to mention 15 years later. Call me back. Bye. I wrapped up my message just as I pulled up to the dirt driveway, which snaked up to my parents' house, and the tin mailbox, with our last name printed on it in big, sloppy white painted letters, which were so faded they could almost no longer be read. I expected to feel the familiar touch of dry paper envelopes when I stuck my arm in the mailbox, but instead brushed up against the stiff plastic of an unmarked VHS tape. My dead parents still had a VCR hooked up and ready to go in their living room. It ironically sat next to a DVD player I gave them about 20 Christmases ago they never set up. My fingertips started to sweat when I pushed the tape into the VCR, hit play, and looked up at the blue screen of the TV. I had no clue what I was about to watch. I took a deep breath when I saw the video open up to a grainy shot. I gulped that breath down when I immediately recognized the setting. The fake wood paneling of the playroom and Barbara's double-wide trailer, which housed her daycare, was unmistakable. I can still remember the box of her room, which was kept empty except for one basket of toys. All those years later, the stale, empty space still gave me a hollow feeling and tingle in my spine. The video cut back to blue again, then crackled back to life with a grainy image of myself, probably 7, dressed in teenage Ninja Mutant Turtles pajamas, and a bowl cut with a cowlick which sat atop a melon head, which was too big for my skinny body. "What's your name?" A groggy male voice I remembered as belonging to Barbara's husband Dale asked my younger self as I looked away from the camera. "Jane," the younger me mumbled on the camera, and winced against the sharp lighting which shone in my face. The camera quickly zoomed out and panned a little to the right to reveal my sister Mandy standing next to me in Little Mermaid pajamas. "And what's your name?" Dale asked. Mandy took a little longer to answer. She quivered, appeared on the verge of tears. I took some time to take in the setting again. Out the window behind both of our little bodies, I could see it was night. Yet, I had no memory of ever being at Barbara's daycare. At night, Mandy, the word barely dribbled out of my sister's pursed lips. I heard a woman's voice mutter something I couldn't make out off the camera, and then the room went dark. I could now just barely see the outlines of my sister and myself in the almost complete blackness. The sounds of myself and my sister beginning to cry filled the darkness for a few seconds before being drowned out by the sound of a quick shake of the entire room. It sounded like someone had thrown down a basketball on the floor as hard as they could, and then caught it on its way back up. Then again, the crying sounds got louder. There it is, the woman's voice off camera got a little louder, and I was able to identify it as belonging to Barbara. "Please, no," my sister cried out. One more thud sound reverberated through the room, followed by a few seconds of silence, and then a horrible screeching sound of a siren rang out. The screeching siren went for a few seconds, and then came to an abrupt stop. The lights flicked on, and Mandy and I stood in our same spots, panting and trying to catch our breath. The thud sound returned. This time, the thud sent my sister and I flying into opposite corners of the room. We each hit the fake wood wall hard and crashed down to the ground. "Stop, we gotta stop," Barbara's voice yelled out from off camera. I saw a younger Barbara walk into frame for a second, and then the video cut out. The video came back on and changed to a close-up shot of Barbara sitting in a chair in the blank playroom, with her plume of blonde hair done up in spectacular fashion, and her cheeks rouged. She looked like she was doing one of those old video dating personals from the early 90s. "My name is Barbara Daniels. I am from Adams Grove, Oklahoma, and I believe we have discovered paranormal powers in our home manifesting themselves in the bodies of 2 young siblings who attend our daycare. What you will see on this videotape is either a spirit or the work of a demon, some kind of poltergeist, and we would like to request the supernatural advocates come to our home in Adams Grove and help us in an episode to figure out what is happening with these children." Barbara stopped for a moment to collect herself. "Can you please explain the situation with the kids?" Dale asked from behind the camera. "The children are ages 7 and 10 and attend my daycare. These episodes start when they fall asleep in the night, and they wake up in a daze before they fall asleep again shortly after. After they wake up, they seem to have absolutely no memory of what happened. However, they constantly talk about how they are scared of the monsters and the bloody monsters, though they do not have many details about what these monsters are. We made these tapes to show what is happening to these kids in hopes they can get the help it appears their parents don't want them to get before something bad happens." The video opened again with Mandy and I standing in the room in our cartoon pajamas trembling. Barbara walked into frame and put her hands on each of our shoulders. "We're right here," Barbara said so quietly the camera barely picked it up. "This is the last time." Barbara got back behind the camera. The lights flicked on and off in the time it took for her to get out of the shot. The thud sound from the earlier footage began again, and the room shook. The younger me dropped to the floor and stuck his face into the carpet. Mandy just kept staring at the camera, seemingly frozen. Another thud. Mandy dropped to the ground like a bomb. Went off. "Screw you," Mandy screamed at the camera. "I'll kill you," she screamed again, and her voice seemed to drop about 10 octaves. "Has this happened before?" Dale asked quietly from behind the camera. No answer from Barbara. "You're a cheater. Mike Blake is a cheater, and everyone needs to know it. You probably have herpes now, or something from her." Mandy took a few defiant steps towards the camera and pointed a flex finger at the lens with hate burning in her eyes. "Who is Mike Blake?" Dale asked. Again, no answer from Barbara. I knew the answer to the question. Mike Blake was my sister's soon-to-be ex-husband she broke up with because he was cheating with a bar woman from town. Mandy collapsed onto the floor on the screen, and younger me rose to my feet at just the same time. As the lights started flickering every half second the way they do when you take the light switch and turn it on and off as fast as you can, then the video cut out. I wasn't going to waste time with a call now. I got back into my truck and drove straight to Mandy's house on the other end of town. Much like my parents, Mandy lived down a long, muddy private driveway which snaked off the highway and led up to a large, but worn down and rustic house at the top of a steep hill. A pack of filthy dogs announced my arrival when I pulled into her gravel driveway and looked up at her house as a thick stream of smoke billowed out the chimney and into the tall trees. The dogs nipped at the dirty cuffs of my jeans when I walked up to the porch and noticed there didn't seem to be a light on anywhere on the property despite the fading sunset and near darkness of the woods around the home. The only light I was able to see came from a candle lit in the window of the living room, which sat next to the front door. I knocked softly on the wooden front door with my eyes stuck on the living room window. I noticed a breeze walk by the lit wick of the candle a few moments after my knock. I held my breath as I listened to footsteps approach the door on the other side. I was shocked by what greeted me when the door opened. I recognized Mandy, but it looked as if she was wearing some kind of Hollywood special effect makeup, which made her look like a real-life witch, wrinkled and just slightly hued yellow. Her skin looked like that of an 80-year-old dying woman's, not that of a woman just in her early 30s. Her eyes were sunken in her skull like a shrunken head, and her hair was a tangled rat's nest on the edge of dreadlocking. "You shouldn't have talked to her," Mandy said before I could get a word out. "You got my message. You shouldn't have talked to her," Mandy repeated. Mandy waved me into the darkness inside her home and shut the door behind me. The house was as cold as it was dark. I shivered through my winter coat when I followed Mandy into the candle-lit living room. I took a seat on the dewy couch in front of a coffee table littered with dirty dishes and dirty laundry. "It's freezing in here," I muttered through clenched teeth. I looked across the room to see Mandy offering me a cigarette from her seat in a stained easy chair. "No thanks," I said with a shake of the head and took the VHS tape out of my jacket pocket. "You shouldn't have talked to her," Mandy cut me off and eyed the tape. "And I've seen that tape too. She gave that video to me. She must have copies or something at Barbara's house." The lights going on and off, us flying around the room and talking about horrible things that happened later in life. I asked. "Yes, what the hell is that?" I asked. Mandy lit up another cigarette. "You know that thing Barbara told you about us always talking about monsters? That was the monsters on that tape. She told me something where we had to stay the night there, and they noticed we had night terrors and these poltergeist abilities, and they recorded it to try and get us on some show where some experts would try to help us, but they ended up never sending in the tapes. I told her to get lost, but regardless, we're both screwed. I think talking about it made the monsters come back." One of Mandy's cigarettes started to sound really good. I couldn't really remember the monsters or ever really thought about them until I ran into Barbara at the deli. "I think they are probably coming back for you too. They terrorized us as kids. I keep seeing this horrible, dead-looking man all around the house," Mandy explained. "What are they? The monsters?" I asked. "They seem to change, but they come when you try to go to sleep and they hide in the shadows, cling to the corners, closets, where it is dark. I don't actually get a good look at them much, but they seem to just look like hideous people. The one I see the most is this guy covered in blood. The images started to come back to me just a little bit, like the mismatched puzzle pieces of a night of blackout drinking might after weeks pass. I could picture myself waking up in the middle of the night in my parents' house, tiptoeing in the dark on the way to the bathroom, or Mandy's room to seek shelter, and seeing the shadows down the hall, or behind the shower curtain, or shaking the doors of my closet. I suddenly felt as if the monsters were crawling all over the room. The childhood fear which paralyzed my every step once the sun went down started to come back. My panicked eyes scanned the room, looking for them. I saw none, but I felt them. If these things work in the dark, then why don't you have any lights on? I asked. You try paying electricity bills when you can't sleep and your piece of trash husband leaves you alone. They shut the power off. Mandy finally seemed to show some energy when she spoke. What are we going to do? I asked. I don't know, Mandy mumbled. Should we go to Barbara with the tapes? I asked. Barbara's house was exactly the same, raised double wide with brown and tan paint, and a wooden deck raised up off the ground level, and a big tool shed. I almost felt like I had traveled back in time just going to the place. Barbara gave us a frazzled look when she saw us standing on her porch. She followed it up with one of those looks someone gives when they pretend to be excited to randomly bump into someone, but are actually horrified about it. You could see the breath get sucked out of her in an instant. Oh hi, Barbara spoke after a few frenzied seconds. Do you want to come in? Here's fine. I whipped the VHS tape out of my jacket pocket and pushed it in her face. What is this? That's the tape we made for the Paranormal Help show. Why did you stick it in our mailbox? I cut off Barbara. I didn't put that in your mailbox, Barbara said defensively. The gears started to turn in my head. She was telling the truth. Barbara was behind me in line at the store when I bumped into her, and I went directly to my truck and raced to my parents right after that. There was no way she got that tape into the mailbox after we talked. I admit, Barbara going on broke me out of my thought process. I took that video, but I gave it to your grandmother years ago, both tapes. My father's mother was a very complicated topic and figure in our lives. I vaguely remember her as a steady presence in our lives, and my very first memories, a rail thin woman with long red hair and pale skin. I seem to remember her always giving me really good salty, sweet cookies that she made, so I thought she was pretty cool. Then, suddenly, she was completely out of our lives. No Thanksgiving, no Christmas, no birthdays, no weddings, funerals, just gone, without any explanation from either of my parents. It was like she had never even existed. I didn't think about my grandma after she disappeared until high school, when Mandy told me she found out our grandma was the person who ran the psychic business along the highway a few towns over. I thought about dropping in there for years, but I never did. I figured it was time to finally pay that palm reader by the highway a visit. The red and purple neon sign I remembered still buzzed in the window of the little house on the edge of the little village of Branchford. It was nearly 9, but the sign still burned the word open into the night. You think she's still alive? Mandy asked. As we sat in the truck, looking at the house, Mom and Dad are already dead. They died super young. I think she's only like in her late 70s, or something. We'll just have to find out, I guess, I answered. They walked up to the door and pressed an electronic doorbell. Classical chimes rang out from inside of the home. The door opened before the chimes stopped, and we came face to face with the grandma we hadn't seen in more than 20 years. Her long red hair was shorter and had turned gray, and her face was a lot less sharp, but it was definitely her. I knew you were coming, Grandma said before ushering us in. Grandma sat us down in her fortune-telling, palm-reading room and poured us cups of hot tea without asking if we wanted them. He watched the tapes, my grandma said once we all sat down on deep purple furniture. Yeah, look, I don't know what happened between you and Mom and Dad, but I don't care. I just want to know what this is and what we can do about it, I explained. I don't want to end up like her, I finished, and pointed to Mandy. My grandma took a deep breath and started in. It's a lot more simple than you might think. When you two were young, I started to notice you had some of the psychic abilities I have. The two of you could see things that hadn't happened yet, or see people in places before they were there, or in states, ages they had not appeared yet. Your parents wanted to put you in therapy, but I knew babysitter who was a client. And it started to work, but your parents found out. Then they cut me off. I had to wait until they died to reach back out to you about it. And it is good timing, because I can tell your powers have come back, and they only come back in this way when something very big is about to happen, something the power wants to tell you about. Now what? I asked. My grandma's face lit up. You need to come back. I can explain to you that what you might think are monsters are not really monsters at all. They are probably just people you know flashing before you at different stages, moments of their lives that you will see. You need to be prepared for the night visions experienced on those tapes as well, because they are coming back. Okay, great, I said sarcastically. I know my vision. It's me, getting on my flight back to Houston tomorrow with a good night's sleep. I got up and Mandy followed me out the door. Grandma stumbled after us with tears in her eyes. You have to come back. I feel something very big coming, my grandma pleaded from her open doorway. Mandy and I ignored Grandma. They walked out to my truck, got inside, and drove away. We pulled away with the tension sweating out of our pores, and into the cramped cab of the single bench truck. Mandy wasn't talking, but I sensed she may have thought I made the wrong decision. I reached over and turned on the radio to try and cut through the animosity in the air. All that came out of the speakers was static. I scanned through more stations, nothing but static. I stopped the dial when I finally reached a station which had sound. The nasally drone of a newscaster speaking in a monotone leaked out the blown speakers. Tornado warnings have been issued for Shelby, Brockton, and Ogden counties. Residents are advised to seek shelter immediately, the newscaster's voice announced. The world outside had seemed to maintain an eerie calm all night, but I noticed the trees, which lined the highway, were swaying violently. Large piles of debris and shrubs were skating across the highway in front of us. A branch broke off a tree and landed in the bed of my truck with a hard thud. The world outside the truck had turned into complete chaos. As we drove into the meager downtown of Branchford, a strangely familiar sound cut into my ears as I slowed the car next to an abandoned church. It was that siren screech from the VHS tape where my sister and I were in the playroom at Barbara's house. It was a tornado warning siren, bellowing from the fire station in the middle of the town. I parked the car in front of the church. Come on, I screamed as loud as I could as I opened the door and let in a horrifying gust of wind. I pushed myself against the wind and out the door. I kept running until I reached the open front door of the church. On the ground of the church, I struggled to breathe and looked back out the open door, where I saw no sign of Mandy. I waited for about 5 seconds before I crawled over to the rows of wooden pews and tucked myself under the first one I could reach. I covered my head, clenched my teeth, and prayed the tornado would pass without killing me. I had survived tornadoes before growing up in Oklahoma, but had never been this close to one, and was sure I was going to die in the rickety church surrounded by abandoned Bibles and the guilt of leaving Mandy behind. Looking back now, the time I spent beneath the pew was probably only about 2 minutes, but the time crawled when I was there. Curled up, fighting against the wind felt like 2 hours. I at first thought I was going to be able to ride out the storm in the church, but then I felt my body lift up into the air. I felt myself soar through the air for a handful of seconds with my eyes shut tight before I crashed hard into the ground and opened my eyes. I was in the yard of the church facing where the church once stood. The faded white building had been reduced to a few scraps of wood and some pews which were flipped over on their side. The siren still rang out at ear-splitting volume, but I heard what is the most disgusting sound I have ever heard in my life. It sounded like someone coughing, sneezing, and barfing at the same time. I turned around to locate the noise and saw Mandy stumbling around the grass behind me, covered in blood which poured out of deep gashes on her forehead and neck. My heart stopped. I had seen this image before, but instead in the dark of my parents' house, inside my closet, when I opened it up to confront the monsters. The last images I had of my sister, stumbling around covered in blood from the tornado, trying not to die, was the image of the monster. The bleeding woman who haunted my childhood was Mandy, the bloody monster. I tried to scream out to Mandy over the roar of the siren, the blasts of the wind, and through my froggy throat, but I couldn't even hear myself scream. I just yelled in vain, until a coat of red blood washed over my eyes, and I passed out. I woke up in a hospital bed with every single atom another soul in the room, just the lonely periodic beep of some machinery, my pain, and a little bit of light which came from the hallway through the open door. I survived. Mandy did not. I would find out later. That day that she bled to death in front of what was left of the church. There was no one to help me pick up the pieces of what happened, but I was able to figure it out mostly on my own. The terrifying incident. That Mandy and I kept having playing out in the night Barbara caught on camera was us seeing the future of the tornado incident, where Mandy would die, and I would almost die. The monsters we would see were each other, covered in blood, 20 years older, and not looking anything like people we would recognize when we were kids. Grandma was right. Her feeling that she needed to warn us was true. The visions had tried to prepare us to survive the most dangerous moment of our lives, but we weren't able to harness it because we weren't trained. My grandma would be the only person who would come visit me in the hospital the week I was there. She accepted my apologies and understood why I dismissed her at first. We never really talked about the visions or seeing into the future in the hospital. We mostly just bonded. She even brought me some of the amazing salted chocolate chip cookies she used to give to me as a kid on my last night in the hospital. We ate them and made plans for me to come back to her office and start working on properly handling my powers when I was ready. My usual work routine and life helped put me back at ease and heal for the first couple of weeks back in Houston, but it would not last. After about 2 weeks, the night visions from my childhood started to come back. At first they were mostly just feelings, or sounds, or a sense that someone was watching me, but things came to a stomach-turning head last night. I woke up because I felt the blanket pull off of my head, as if someone had tugged it back towards my feet. Having to pee, I got up out of bed and headed to the bathroom, trying to keep myself from fully waking up. I didn't turn on the light in the bathroom, just started pissing in the near dark. Things were going smoothly until I noticed a shadow and heard the faint sound of something swaying behind the shower curtain. I clenched my teeth hard and whipped open the shower curtain. Dangling from the shower head was the gray, naked corpse of my grandma, noose around her neck. I screamed and ran back to my bed before I was even finished going to the bathroom. I laid frozen until the sun came up. I started calling the number my grandma gave me, but I'm starting to get very worried because she hasn't answered any of my calls.